Jack.
Levi.
The Book Club from Hell.
Hello everyone, this is Jack with the Book Club from Hell. Two friends going slowly insane from reading the literary output of Greek statue Twitter. This week's episode is on Selective Breeding and the Birth of Philosophy by Costin Alamariu, a Romanian-American man who may or may not be the niche online celebrity Bronze Age Pervert. Besides possibly being X.com's premier aspiring nudist bodybuilder and appreciator of Nietzsche, Alamariu majored in mathematics at MIT, studied postgraduate philosophy at Columbia University, before completing a PhD in political science at Yale with his 2015 dissertation, The Problem of Tyranny and Philosophy in the Thought of Plato and Nietzsche. This dissertation was published in 2023 under the title of Selective Breeding and the Birth of Philosophy, with a new introduction in which Alamariu revealed the true meaning of his dissertation, a description of a millennia-spanning process of the formation, veiling and uncovering of the foundations of philosophy, the concept of nature, that is, of selective breeding. If you like what we're doing with this podcast and want to support us, we have a Patreon account, the link to which is in the show notes. We release bonus episodes on Patreon and have weekly chats with subscribers about our most recent episodes. I've also published a novel called Tower, a surreal, absurd journey involving the medical treatment of souls, a tower who remakes the world in its image, amphetamines, and a talking briefcase. You can find Tower on Apple Books or on Amazon, the links to which are in the show notes. Finally, we have a Discord server for this podcast, on which you can find Levi, me, and plenty of other degenerates who listen to the Book Club from Hell, the link to which is, you guessed it, in the show notes. So, if the idea of a eugenic underpinning of philosophy sounds remotely interesting to you, then listen on. Enjoy. It's not, I don't think either Costin Alamariu or Bronze Age Pervert have publicly confirmed that they're the same person. Rumours are flying that they are the same person. I think in the Atlantic, some article was published by someone who claims to know Costin Alamariu and happens to know of his various Twitter handles. So the extent to which you trust the Atlantic talking about a notorious far-right, alt-right, ultra-right figure, a Twitter shitposter, and author of one odd book which started this podcast, that's up to you. However, the two of them do have a lot of very similar preoccupations. They
probably get along, I think.
Yeah, I'd say there's almost a perfect overlap in the things they're interested in. The differences really are in how they express themselves. So, Selective Breeding and the Birth of Philosophy is a doctoral thesis at Stanford University, so there's less caveman speak and less Twitter speak than in Bronze Age mindset. But they both really, really like Plato. They really like Nietzsche, really like Camille Paglia. They are very similar at the very least. At the very least, extremely similar people. Alcibiades as well. Just absolutely love that guy. Really, really admire him. The Nietzschean desire for men of genius to rise above the masses and not merely dominate them, but step outside of their conventional morality. That's very much present in both books as well. A lot more lucidly presented in Selective Breeding and the Birth of Philosophy, and I would be interested to return to Bronze Age mindset having read this and see if it's a bit more coherent afterwards.
Yeah. Yeah, I wonder what rereading that would be like in light of reading this book.
Yeah, I mean, I've got it on our episode list, redoing Bronze Age mindset. Apart from anything else,
100.
It's our first episode. It's probably our worst one, and that's where a bunch of people are introduced to us, so it's probably worth redoing that. Bronze Age Revisited in light of what may or may not have been Bronze Age Pervert's doctoral thesis in political philosophy. Even if they're not the same person, it makes a lot of Bronze Age mindset a lot clearer.
Conveniently.
Yeah. The overlap between the two books is truly remarkable. So, Costin Alamariu is a Romanian-American guy who was born in Romania, moved to the US when I think he was 10 or thereabouts, so he was pretty young. Studied maths at MIT. I think he studied at Columbia as well. I think he studied philosophy. And the book we read for this episode was his doctoral thesis in political philosophy at Yale. Or was it Stanford? Let me have a look.
Yale, hey? I think it might have been Yale. But yes, like one of the
PhD
one of the good
in
skills.
political science at Yale. The 2015 dissertation titled The Problem of Tyranny and Philosophy in the Thought of Plato and Nietzsche. So finished in 2015, published in 2023 with a brand new introduction where it's very Straussian. He spends a lot of the introduction saying that he's not a Straussian, but he then goes on to say that he wrote his thesis in academia. So naturally, the ideas contained in his thesis are certainly present in it. However, through the art of writing, he's covered them. There's an exoteric and an esoteric Alamariu, and the esoteric Alamariu is brought to the masses, brought to light for the first time with the 2023 publication of Selective Breeding and the Birth of Philosophy, where in his new introduction he lays out what he was actually saying without all of the qualifications that are throughout the body of this work, where he'll say, oh, I am, for convenience's sake, going to speak in the voice of Nietzsche, or I'm going to speak in the voice of Callicles. And then he'll go on to talk about depletion of genetic stocks and the need to breed people to produce geniuses. Very similar to the... I'll stop going on about this, but very similar to the talk about yeast men, bug men, the longhouse, mere life in Bronze Age mindset. It's just less irritatingly put and just more coherent. Less talking about like hallucinating vampire bats when he's taking the holy aminos in a porn theater or something like that. What were your impressions going into this book? Were you aware of this book? Because I'd seen like pictures of people carrying the banana yellow book with the like admittedly pretty cool front cover. It's a nice looking edition. So I was aware of it, but I didn't quite know what would be in it.
Yeah. What were my expectations going in? I half expected it to basically just be an what would you say an academic version of of Bronze Age mindset. And I kind of think that's what it is.
yeah, that's not unfair. that description is probably about 90% of the way there with this book. It is Bronze Age mindset, but as a doctoral thesis.
Yeah.
And it is shockingly a very readable doctoral thesis. It's actually quite fun to read. It's well written. It's not turgid. I'm very surprised that a doctoral student came up with something that could be this easily read.
It's funny, isn't it? Like then compared to his writing style in Bronze Age mindset, he must have been very intentional in the way that he wrote Bronze Age mindset. I wonder how much he edited, because I assume with his doctoral thesis he would have spent a lot of time editing as well. So maybe with Bronze Age mindset he just didn't invest as much in editing.
It's just how he talks.
Yeah, I don't know.
I doubt Bronze Age mindset came about as the result of a lack of editing. Like the bizarre spellings, the unga bunga ooga booga grammatical structures are just too intentional. I think I recall for our Bronze Age mindset episode we were saying like how much of this is intentional. Having read this book, and to preface all of this, I'm just going to be for the rest of the episode operating on the assumption that Costin Alamariu is Bronze Age Pervert.
Yeah.
But having read this, it's extremely intentional that it's written in just such a bizarre way, which in terms of as a marketing stunt is pretty good to make your book just really odd.
Yeah.
But Look,
What
he
about
tried
you?
it and it worked. He has a degree of niche internet fame.
What were your expectations going in?
I'd read an article in The Atlantic that I mentioned at the start of the episode about, I think it was either about the quote unquote new right. There are a lot of new rights. The new right comes around every 10 or 15 years, apparently. Or it was specifically about Bronze Age Pervert. I forget which, but it was mentioned that he'd written a doctoral thesis and that his thesis advisor felt that it was a genuinely novel interpretation of Plato and Nietzsche, however, one that was wrong, that this advisor just disagreed with.
Yeah.
So I was quite interested to know what was in the thesis, having read that, knowing that it was, or at least alleged to be, Bronze Age Pervert in human form, writing about philosophy from a perspective of actually knowing about it, which interestingly is another question that we had about Bronze Age mindset when we first read it. It's how much is this guy trolling? How much does he actually know about Greek philosophy and Greek history? Turns out a lot. It's like a postgraduate amount. So I was interested. Then when I heard that it had been published, I was even more interested in knowing what he said, but was a bit hesitant just because Bronze Age mindset, I think I like the idea of Bronze Age mindset more than I like Bronze Age mindset. Like, conceptually, it's very funny. It's like a book of the sort of biologically essentialist right-wing Nietzschean Platonic run through Greek statue Twitter and written like a caveman. That sounds fun, but in practice, it's just exhausting. I tried reading it again, like flicking through it, and I got to a few pages in and just thought, I can't be bothered. I can't deal with this.
Yeah.
So I was hesitant on the basis of that. Granted, yeah, like for your PhD thesis, you're probably not going to write it like a Cro-Magnon, but maybe you did. I don't know.
Yeah, that would be funny.
So I was pleasantly surprised by the book that it's readable, which is nice, and it presents such a bizarre thesis, which he actually does provide evidence for and argues for an extended period, that I ended up having a much better time with it than I thought I would.
Mm.
It was also quite interesting too with the introduction to the book, how he only spends a few pages doing this, but at the end of the introduction, he talks about right-wing movements or new right-wing movements. And I found that interesting because the extent to which Bronze Age Pervert is or will be some sort of focus for latent right-wing energies among today's youth, in a real sense, remains to be seen, or is at least debatable. Or whether he is just a figurehead or a meme, some sort of cartoon that people find funny to talk about but don't take particularly seriously. I'm not sure. It's also really hard to tell on the internet just both how sincere people are being and also the extent to which the sound and fury on x.com, the complaints about the longhouse and women and yeast men, the extent to which that translates into real-world political organisation, real-world political effects it's tenuous. But nonetheless, he is someone who, even if as simply a figurehead, is involved in that world. So hearing his perspective on the youth right was interesting. Like, I'd take his opinion. When I say seriously, again, I'm not sure if the movement will be as powerful as he says it is, but I think he at least has a lot of insights about this world, given that he is so much a part of it. So the introduction to this was surprisingly good as well.
His ascension to like weird internet notoriety over the last few years, I guess, what's interesting about it is that I guess if you keep at content creation for long enough, and if you're consistent, you're putting in place the mechanism to find people who are at least like somewhat tangentially interested in the thing that you're interested in. So it's hard to, you kind of have to wait like how serious like a cultural phenomena or a subculture is, weight that by, or in particular, like what would you say, an influencer's audience. You have to weight that by the fact that like now these days, like you can get people who are like very geographically dispersed who would prior to the internet have been able to connect, but now can connect. And so you have this kind of like what would you say, like evaluation that's difficult to evaluate, like how significant this actually is. Like, is it actually just like a few hundred people making a lot of noise, and or like a few thousand people making a lot of noise, and then a bunch of, you know, like a broader circle that are just like, oh, that's kind of, you know, funny, and yeah, like we think like, you know, young men should get jacked and stuff and all this sort of thing, but they don't really take the core ideas seriously. Like it's very difficult to get a read on these sorts of things with the current technologies, you know.
Combination of that, and then even if supposing Greek statue Twitter is as ideologically committed as its Twitter accounts say they are, so suppose we take them seriously. Another question though is then, to what extent can they politically organize and affect change outside of Twitter? Because it's one thing to I don't know, shout a lot on Twitter and find people who agree with you. That's fine. That's one step. The thing is, though, how much of a disconnect is there between what people are willing to do in terms of arguing on Twitter or like posting memes that irritate campus leftists or, you know, boomer cons or something like that.
Yeah.
versus actually get out in the street and do something. You know, get out in the street, overthrow the Longhouse, destroy democracy, find Red Caesar. I'm not convinced that most of the message board energy you find will translate into political action. But then again, like I said earlier, I'm not sure. Maybe we are viewing the hothouse of the future right-wing youth revolution, but
maybe
it's hard to say.
Potentially, I guess only time will tell.
Only time will tell. And if they do win, I will be changing this episode to me just full-throatedly endorsing this book for 2.5 hours. Yeah,
this book.
Have to rewrite. I'll rewrite the past to ingratiate myself with the present.
I'm personally not worried about the right-wing youth revolution. I think if Bronze Age Pervert is the best that they've got, it'll be okay. The future will be fine.
Bronze Age Pervert,
if that's their figurehead.
Yeah, I don't know. I think in terms of figureheads, the dual persona of Bronze Age Pervert, Costin Alamariu, is well suited to the internet and well suited to getting attention on the internet, because you have sort of the court jester of Bronze Age Pervert, who attracts attention because he's ridiculous and kind of funny. And then you have the side of Costin Alamariu, who is actually able to debate political philosophy very effectively. So it's a new model that could work. We'll see.
Yeah, like a dual persona strategy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think if he is as philosophically sharp and of such great stock that he should be able to like grow some balls and just take ownership of it and straightforwardly just unify the identities and not hide behind a fake identity. But you know, but I mean, I'm just thinking like if he thinks he's that good, like that he should should actually back it up and not be a little pussy about it. But whatever. maybe the dual strategy of like split identity is a new way to go about doing it. I guess like I can see the appeal of it, especially if you wanted to have like multiple pseudonyms and like come at it from different angles. So I just think it's ironic, like given that he talks a big game about the importance of aristocratic like values, and then kind of doesn't actually unify his identity. I think I
don't know. Having read this book, it would be very much of a piece with what he says Plato did, which we'll get into.
Yeah, true. That's a good point.
Plato's project was to take a radicalization of Pindar's idea of aristocratic fusus and then provide an esoteric and exoteric version of it. So the esoteric version is this abstraction of the idea of nature. The exoteric version is to be the defender of conventional morality.
Yeah.
So in that sense, the Bronze Age pervert hiding the extremity between a mask of grinning nihilism.
Yeah, I guess it's the Straussian analysis. My limited quick glancing of like what exactly Straussian analysis is, or like Straussianism is, seems like it just gives you the leeway to interpret somebody however you want, and it's like, oh, it's the hidden meaning. So like I don't really take that particularly seriously either.
I wouldn't dismiss it. So for example, Strauss did talk about, for example, Islamic philosophers.
Yeah.
Who wanted to talk about things that would have been forbidden under Islam. So they did write in a way with an exoteric, forward-facing exterior, which would allow them to continue writing, and an esoteric philosophy that could be read within their philosophy if you knew where to look. Similarly with Plato, it wouldn't completely surprise me if there were actually an esoteric and an exoteric Plato, given that he was writing at a time when, or at least part of his life after Socrates had been executed, in part for teaching philosophy and for having taught philosophy to people like Critias, and I think Alcibiades as well.
Yeah, except the difference, the key thing is that you have to have, like, in order to like make that interpretation not arbitrary, you have to have a good explanation as to why there is that disjunction between the exoteric and the esoteric. You can't just like make up an esoteric interpretation and just say, well, it's a Straussian analysis. You have to like explain why that person has created this disjunction and why that's better than an explanation than just taking them at as close to face value as you can.
Oh, I agree completely.
Yeah.
But as I said, I think the case for Plato making a defense of philosophy and reading it in a Straussian sense is not unreasonable, which is much of what he's saying here.
And then the question
you can disagree that Plato is arguing for basically philosophical eugenics. Like that's fine. But the fundamental idea of a Straussian analysis, if you take that to mean broadly looking for the esoteric and exoteric meanings of something, I think is pretty reasonable.
Yeah. So once you make the claim that there's two meanings to like a text or to a philosopher's work, there's the exoteric, fairly straightforward version, which I suppose everybody could find a reasonably like conciliant interpretation of within some like window of variation. But then like the esoteric interpretation, like how many different esoteric interpretations do you have, and how do you distinguish between which one of them is correct? Like Bronze Age perverts, or Alamariu. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing his name. Okay, the Alamariu. It's a really cool name, by the way. Like of all the interpretations a Straussian could have of Plato, he wrote a lot of stuff, right? Like, and an important philosopher, like, gotten a lot of attention. Like, why would this particular interpretation like supersede other esoteric interpretations?
Fortunately,
that would be one of my questions. Like, no, not exactly that there is an interpretation, but like I've read other people's like interpretations of Plato, and a lot of like some of the other ones are like also what would you call like also kind of try to read between the lines, and I can't see how they can exclude one another. Like you could simultaneously have, like esoteric interpretation B and A and esoteric interpretation B, and I can't. Well, at least I haven't seen a way in which they like rule each other out. So you can have two. Yeah. Anyway, sorry, I'll stop.
Yeah, we can get to that after we've explained what the book's about. To that, and this goes for both of us, probably the deeper your knowledge of Platonic philosophy goes, the more able you will actually be to distinguish between different interpretations. Because, sure, there's probably an infinite number of interpretations you can make. Interpretation that, say, the Gorgeus is about an intergalactic war between the denizens of Agartha and Saturn, and then someone from the Andromeda Galaxy. Like, that's actually quite low down the list of what's likely. Like, sure, you can make lots of interpretations, but as you have a deeper knowledge of the text, the number of them that are more plausible probably does narrow quite significantly.
Yeah.
So, this book is basically a reading of Plato, particularly the gorgeous. It's not a dialogue because I think it's between three people plus Socrates, and then the work of Nietzsche. And in general, what Alamariu is saying is that you have the aristocratic ideal of nature, capital N nature, which boils down effectively to breeding, to heritable physical and mental characteristics, or just physical characteristics insofar as you think that mental faculties are an expression of the physical. And this knowledge of nature, of heritable nature, and therefore of perfectible nature, of being able to breed better people as you would breed better animals, was threatened, or is constantly threatened by convention, or nomos, he calls it. And he sees this aristocratic morality as a bulwark of fusus, which roughly means in ancient Greek, like body or something inborn, something becoming, something growing. Like, it's a very biological term. It's a bastion of fusus against nomos in the aristocracy. As the aristocracy in Greece began to fall apart, Plato came in and packaged up this idea of nature. He took the idea of nature that was present in the ancient Greek aristocracy and abstracted it and generalized it and made it so that it could be applied to a greater number of situations rather than just the ancient Greek polis or the Athenian polis. And he hid this meaning of nature underneath a defense of conventional morality, of a defense of nomos, to prop up the ailing aristocracy, so to give them virtues that, if they stuck to, would allow them to at least some extent rule effectively. Also to make philosophers publicly palatable, because philosophers were being persecuted at the time, and Plato was worried that there wouldn't be any of them left if that persecution continued. And this apparently esoteric concept of nature was passed down through the ages. However, it was then threatened by Christianity, which embraced the esoteric Plato, but embraced the exoteric Plato, the defense of conventional morality, but wasn't aware of the esoteric Plato. And so eventually you had Nietzsche come along, who understood Plato's hidden meaning and decided to reveal it to the world, because he was afraid that the ability for philosophers to be born was now under grave threat. And so as an emergency measure, he felt that he had to reveal what Plato had hidden so carefully 2,000 odd years before. So that's at a very high level what Alamariu says, and we'll go through some of the important bits of that. So both where sort of nomos and fusus came from, and this is in the ancient Greek context because that's what he studied. But he also says that this is the place where, at least in the West, our idea of philosophy really came from. So he also says, at least for a significant portion of the world, this is where you'd be studying, where it would make sense to be studying historically. We can then talk about the decline of the Greek polis and Plato's project of abstracting Pindar. And then we can talk about how Plato hid it, particularly in the Gorgeous, and particularly through the character of Callicles arguing with Socrates. Callicles as representing, at least according to Alamariu, what Plato really thought, trademark. And how Socrates is more or less agreeing with Callicles, but doing so in a way that appears that he's disagreeing with him. And even the way in which he disagrees apparently demonstrates that he knows what he's doing. Plato is winking at you through the ages. We can start with the original Gynogerontocracy, which is like, there's just one of the parts where I was reading it and I thought, yeah, this is Bronze Age Pervert. This is him. He's putting it a bit differently. He's not talking about the Longhouse, but the Longhouse and the totalizing nomos of the Gynogerontocracy are similar. There's a lot of overlap between the two.
Yeah, and he conceived of this, like, what did he call it, like primordial or primitive mind being like ensconced in a sort of totalitarian social structure where, what do you call it, like the purest democracy or something like that, like
yeah, so he says, and I'm pretty sure when he's talking about this, he means particularly settled people who are farming.
Yeah.
He doesn't like grain eaters. But for tribes, those of a pre-philosophic mind, because we'll get into, for him, the idea of philosophy and the idea of nature are effectively the same, or at least are so connected that you really can't conceive of philosophy without first this idea of nature. So the pre-philosophic mind is a group of people ruled by a stifling, all-encompassing tradition, nomos, which is enforced by a council of elder people or elders and women, and really seeks to control particularly young men, because young men are a source of instability or of resistance to nomos because of their ability to be effectively violent, which is something that women and older people just don't have the capacity for compared to like a 19-year-old guy. And it's a place where any attempt to leave nomos is punished. And the nomos is so totalizing that it's hard to even conceive of a way out of nomos, or a way to stand outside of it. And so Alamariu says this is present basically all over the world, but also for the purposes of this book, it's present in ancient Greece, or the part of the world, that geographic territory which became ancient Greece. Is even before that. So you got these grain-eating farmers just living in nomos, being bug men. Well, having said, I don't want to mix terminologies. When I say bug men, I'm not enough of a Bronze Age pervert scholar to know if bug men specifically refers to the modern instantiation of this, or if this is a general term that can be applied across the ages. So I'll retract bug men. I'll say mere life. Yeah, he likes that Nietzschean.
Well, that was
mere life.
Yeah, mere life.
Which, I mean, Nietzsche loved it. He said it all the time. The way out of this original gynogerontocracy is not from within the gynogerontocracy. If you're within the bounds of nomos, you can't really escape it. So how they did get out of it was by domination by a tribe of nomadic pastoralists. And presumably the nomadic pastoralists weren't themselves subject to the nomos situation, because one of my problems was, if the base state of humanity is this totalizing nomos, it's fine to say the way out of it is to be conquered by a tribe who have a different nomos. And then once you've got that dual structure, you can see a difference between them. I guess I can maybe see a way out of this. So it's not so much that the conquering tribe has no nomos of their own, no totalizing nomos. It's more that they conquer a tribe, and these two nomoses, I'm not sure what the plural of nomos in ancient Greek is, for which I apologize, but these two nomoses, you can see the contrast between them, and maybe that offers a way out of nomos. Or maybe this totalizing nomos is a function of settled agricultural people, and the conquering pastoralists, because they're mobile, they rely more on physical might. They breed animals, and through the breeding of animals is where the first germ of this idea of nature comes from. Because through animal breeding, these people noticed that certain traits in animals are heritable. And so they would breed animals to produce stronger specimens. Through this, they started to gain an appreciation not of nature in the abstracted Platonic sense, but a pre-Socratic idea of nature. And that was enough to crack their gynogerontocracy, which allowed them to then go and conquer another gynogerontocracy and impose their warrior nomos upon it. And it's not clearly stated the big problem for me of how do you have event one of like one group leaving this gynogerontocratic nomos, because once you've got one who's left, I can then see how his proposed process takes place. It's just like, okay, well, you go and conquer, impose your separate nomos, and then the contrast breaks nomos. But it's that first event. The first one is more difficult for me.
Why did they switch over from being yeast people, bugmen?
Yeah,
breeding
yeast.
breeding plants.
I take back what I said earlier. I do want to use Bronze Age Pervert.
it's a lot more fun than Alamariu's. I hate normal writing. I mean, there's a few problems, but before I get into like the problems with it, I just wanted to double check with you. Like, I'm pretty sure he stated this explicitly, but he does mean that this. I'm pretty sure he says that like this breaking of nomos, the necessary cause was animal husbandry. It's not that like, oh, this was the historical happenstance, but this, like, if humans had not started animal husbandry and intentionally breeding for specific traits animals, then we would never have had philosophy in the sense that he is talking about. Am I correct in my
Yeah. I think he's very clear with that. So when I talk about event one, as like breaking nomos as the first event and having a problem with that, that's why I said my best guess as to how that happens is through animal husbandry. That somehow through that process, it allows them to break the rule of convention in favor of a powerful specimen. And like, in this, you can see how Nietzschean he is. This is.
So I just have some questions. I guess I don't.
I've got a lot of questions.
I guess I don't like. I don't want to make them too pointedly. Just like me, just saying how wrong I think he is. But maybe, I don't know, if you want to play like Alamariu.
I'll
for a little bit.
I'll be Alamariu, but. This is normally what happens in episodes. Is I end up being the stand-in for the author. I will be Costin Alamariu. I'm not going to do the accent.
At sincerely adopting the other person's like arguments to the best of your ability. It's very good.
I am now a what was he called? An aristocratic radical. That's it, or a radical aristocrat. That is me.
How come the selective breeding of plants didn't trigger this event, because the selective breeding of plants has been going on not in the region of Greece, but actually near it, like in the region of like the Tigris and Euphrates, that sort of region, for like 7 to 10,000 years at least. Like, how come that particular genetic bioengineering wasn't the cause of this transition to philosophy? Why was animal husbandry and not plant-based genetic engineering?
There are a few things in that which are interesting, because he does acknowledge it's not plant husbandry. Well, what's the word for doing it, but with a plant?
Like horticulture.
Horticulture, that's it. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah.
In the section, I think it's the chapter on Pindar, and the meaning of the word fusus, he does bring up I'm pretty sure he brings up, in the context of the Iliad, I think there were 2 uses of the term fusus, and one of them was with respect to plants. And he makes a lot of this, and he brings up several examples of it referring to plants, and then using that as evidence for, look, when they talk about fusus, they are referring to biology, to things growing, to things actualizing themselves organically. So yeah, he's aware of that, but then, like you said, he seems to think that the way to break that original nomos, or the Gynocratic nomos, is only through animal husbandry. I wonder if it is then so I'm not talking as Costin Alamariu. I categorically believe that it is. through my knowledge of myself, having read 2 books that I've written. Maybe it's observing breeding is necessary but not sufficient. Maybe it's a combination of a pastoralist life as opposed to a settled life, because he does talk about, in the chapter on Plato, the importance of Socrates being referred to as a wild man, the importance of several Greek mythological figures being taken in by Chiron, the wild beast, for training to take them outside of the city, outside of convention, and make them powerful. So maybe it's a combination of viewing what we would now call genetics in plants or animals.
Yeah.
But also there's a necessary wildness which is not present in settled agricultural life to nearly the same extent as it would be in nomadic pastoralist life. And then I'm not sure to what extent this is historically accurate, but at least he says pastoralists were just way more warlike. Like, they wandered around and took people's stuff, whereas grain-eating soy boys were peaceful and just wanted to get along. So maybe it's a few factors. It's the genetics plus the specific circumstances of pastoralist warrior bands that together led to the break of Gynocratic nomos. And a shorthand of that is, they observed animal husbandry because that was the only breeding they were doing. They weren't worrying about plants. And that's the best I can do.
Okay. You don't have to try to answer them too hard, but I can just cover a couple of the quick ones. Okay, so I believe actually animal husbandry, and selective breeding of animals, including goats and cattle, actually had occurred thousands of years earlier in Egypt. How come philosophy didn't emerge there? Because he claims that this is the cradle of, this is where it first happened. And it's no, it didn't. That's just historically wrong. Why didn't? If that's the necessary cause.
Well, it depends. We don't really have historical records of ancient Egyptian philosophy in the same way that we have ancient Greek philosophy.
But we do have. They did have a civilization, though. They did have a civilization, though.
Civilization, but he's not saying civilization. He's saying in this specifically philosophy.
Okay, so that actually no. So we should wind back. So that's a good point. So. And maybe I just didn't. Like, it didn't click for me exactly what he means by philosophy. Do you want to like expound on that a little bit? Because like to me, it almost seemed as though, it felt as though he's using the word philosophy in a very particular way, but you one sense would be like which maybe you can talk about like essentially saying it's like the idea of nature, but it's like how come other what things like why is that what philosophy is, and how come other things that aren't philosophy?
Mm. How about we get to that by talking about the process of discovering this concept of nature? Because,
Sure.
at least for listeners who haven't read the book, our talk about that, or like you talking to Costin Alamariu through the vessel of me, will make more sense, and it would just be easier to listen to.
Yeah, sure.
Do you have more questions for Costin?
Yeah, and what
before
about
we go
like
through Pindar?
Haven't animals, at least like dogs, for example, been selectively bred by humans for just like an untold of amount of time, like prehistory sort of thing? Like, how come that instance of like animal has like very explicit like selective breeding of a species didn't cause an earlier discovery of philosophy?
So it could be, he hasn't specified how common it is to generalize from the idea of animal husbandry to the idea of nature to philosophy.
So
Because even in the ancient Greek context, it took a really long time. So it could be that it's a really rare event. He also seems to think that the specifics of the aristocratic structure of society in the ancient Greek policies was really important. And then the specific conditions of the ancient Greek aristocratic life, which was extremely restrictive, extremely hard on those within it. So producing very, very disciplined, educated people and breeding them. Like, he's very explicit when he's like, yeah, these people were bred to be superior and then trained intensely. A combination of that and then the moment of the degradation of that disciplinary society allowed this flourishing. And it was in that you got this transfer from a more parochial idea of nature to philosophy. My best guess as the answer to that question is that this is a rare event, and in ancient Greece, like, they threaded the needle of the particular circumstances required. I think also, I'm not sure if he says it was only in ancient Greece where it was started or not. I don't recall, but like supposing he did say it's just in ancient Greece, it's a rare event.
Yeah. Okay.
Do you have any other questions, or should we go on to Pindar?
How do you reckon that it's without counterfactual reasoning? How can you say that it is the necessary cause? Like, it's historically the case that if you take Dr. Alamariu's like story, at least like historical declarative facts as true, that this emergence of philosophy happened, even if you say it's only once in this particular context, and the necessary cause was this, like, how do I put this question? How come the thinking of nature couldn't have occurred from some other problem situation? How come this is the only possible problem situation that could have caused thinking about this stuff?
Because I don't know if he says it's the only possible way. I think he's saying that it is, like, that's how it happened. I'm not sure he's saying it couldn't possibly have happened otherwise. Limiting it to just saying, okay, let's assume that he says this is the only possible way, just to make our lives easier. So I don't have to keep qualifying with, I'm not sure he said that. Why is this the only way?
when somebody says something is the necessary cause,
it could be.
That implies that it's the thing that if that hadn't have happened, then we wouldn't have this thing.
Not necessarily. So, like, if he's saying,
well, then
this
it's not
is
a necessary
how it happened,
cause.
without
It's
explicitly saying it might have happened otherwise, then like he would be leaving open the possibility of it happening otherwise. He's just saying, but this is what happened. But again, like, let's just assume.
I guess my interpretation of the way that he was talking was it seemed as though he's saying, like, no, it wouldn't have happened otherwise.
Mm.
And I might be wrong in my understanding of like his argument, but happy to be wrong if that's in fact the case. But
my reading was it's likely that he's saying that this is the way it has to happen. And if you don't have this knowledge of heritability, then you don't eventually develop an idea of nature and then an abstracted idea of nature and philosophy. But maybe I'm just being pedantic. It's because he didn't actually explicitly say that. My reading is, I'm 90% sure that that's what he means, but I'm not going to really like strictly say this is what he said. I'm going to say that that's probably what he means. In terms of like answering that question, so is your question's basically like, why couldn't something else have caused this? Like, I don't know, looking at like astronomy, like observing the movement of stars, and from that developing an idea of an understandable, explicable natural world.
Yeah, or even just like looking at like, if there's all these nomadic tribes, they go to different like ecosystems and they see like different animals are in different ecosystems. Like, why wouldn't they have that prompted their thinking about like the nomos independent reality of the world? Like, to me, it just seems, and I guess this is more broadly speaking, more why I kind of like don't really like academic philosophy, whether it's like left wing, whether it's left wing or right wing is. I would include this guy's text in this, like, and sometimes why I can't read other like purely philosophical works is because they like their approach is, I'm going to just ensconce you in confirmatory evidence as to my point of view, and not actually think of reasonable like counter arguments and confront those counter arguments directly. And it's like there's a lot of really like very simple counter arguments, like historical facts, counterfactual thinking, like just the fact that other cultures have done stuff with animals like for tens of thousands of years, that like it's like he just doesn't address any of that. And it's not because of his necessarily like a bad thinker per se, but it's because that's like how it's done in this part of the academy, is you batter your opponent over the head with a thesis that is just you giving confirmatory evidence like for hundreds of pages. And I just like but there's so many like counter arguments that you need to address like in order for this to be like a reasonable explanation of this thing. So I'd say that he was very much following in the tradition of his academic culture in the way that he wrote this book, even if on the edge he's like, okay, fine, he's a little bit edgy, right-winged, but he's extremely, extremely academic. So he's actually not
it's the yeah, but why?
He's not particularly contrarian, if you ask me. He's like extremely like he's extremely conformist in the context of the way that he wrote his PhD.
Yeah.
I don't know how much it's coming across that I have an intense disdain for this person. So I'll try to reduce.
I think there's a reason why I'm often the one who's defending the books we read or inhabiting the author of the books we read.
Yeah, I guess for me with this one in particular, it's like I kind of got I got a bit of a kick out of Bronze Age mindset, because it was the way that it came across and like the way that it was written and stuff. And this was just like, oh no, now it's the same underlying like eugenicist like apologetics, except in academic form.
Yeah, it's not as funny.
I can't. It's like, no, it's not about this. But I will try to reduce my disdain for the rest of the episode.
Oh, you can do that. It's
I don't want to
I
make
think
you
I play a
always defend.
homeostatic function in our episodes where the more disdain you have for the book, the more I have to homeostatically defend it so that people actually learn about what's in the book.
I mean, also, like, to be fair, like, in my defense, not just being a curmudgeon, like, I think, like, asking questions is also a good way to learn about the book.
It is.
It just completely...
If you've got
take
someone
up all the
around who
bandwidth.
will take the time to answer them, it is very helpful.
Take up all the bandwidth with just questions. So yeah, those are my questions.
So
now,
in terms of why it had to arise in this way, it's within his intellectual system. Like it is like reading Evola or Spengler. The answer comes from within the constraints that he establishes of the system to begin with. And like with those thinkers, it's if you ask, yeah, but why? So if you step outside of the intellectual system, then the justifications for it just don't work. Like it poorly generalizes outside of itself. So
there's a self-containment problem almost, like in that way of like going about writing your argument or like your thesis, isn't there? Like, now that I think about it, like, you really wouldn't want to like spend a significant part of your life, such as 3 or 4 years during your 20s or whatever, dedicating your life, or like in the case of Spengler, like 10 years, creating a self-contained system that as soon as it's subjected to like external criticism, it just falls apart. That would be, I feel like that's, at least for me personally, that makes me think like it would be really good to like, if I ever spend a significant amount of time in my life like writing a book like on my perspectives of things, that I like really try to engage with like external criticisms of the way I'm thinking, rather than just trying to like make it like a hermetically sealed piece of pristine, like internally consistent logic.
Yep.
That can't withstand external insult. Yeah, anyways. Yeah, cool. Nice. Good answer.
So I think that it's because of how he defines nature versus nomos, or convention versus nature. Is that
convention versus
convention? Is this? It's a social phenomenon mediated by the relationships between people, and in that sense, it is changeable. So from within nomos, you can't change the nomos from within it because you're ensconced in it. Your way of viewing the world and engaging within the world is within the perspective or within the context of that nomos. However, the way that, and I'm basically just getting on to Pindar. So for listeners, he talks about Pindar, who was a Dorian poet in Thebes. I think he was 6th century BC, I'm pretty sure. Like, Jamie can fact check that one. He wrote of Greek aristocratic morality a lot, that of blood, body, heredity versus convention, wisdom, manly virtues of giving good advice in a political context, and also manly courage in battle as being these great virtues, or the two greatest virtues of someone. And he does this largely through the concept of fusus, and the chapter on Pindar is mostly learning about or looking at how to define fusus. And I'm bringing up Pindar now because my answer to your earlier question will probably just turn into like explaining this chapter as well. So I may as well. So he sees fusus as its body. It is something inborn. It is innate talent. He quotes a bunch of ancient Greek words, which I don't really remember, but they mean effectively like almost having more being, just having more of this inner drive, which manifests itself as great acts in someone with a lot of fusus, a lot of body. And fusus stands against nomos because, unlike nomos, which is this contingent thing, it's based upon these, if not explicitly agreed upon, relations between people, then at least things which have been learned. You're born into a certain nomos, you learn it, you are enculturated. It's not as totalizing, or I wouldn't say it's as totalizing as he's making it out to me, but maybe I'm saying that because I'm ensconced within my own totalizing nomos. But the idea of you being enculturated into something is not that controversial. he just takes it very far. Very far. So fusus stands against this because once fusus is acknowledged, you acknowledge that someone is born with this innate greatness. So some people are just born with more greatness than others. And that greatness is expressed independently of nomos. Or what nomos does is it normalizes. So if someone is too great and is great in a way that begins to push against nomos, they're pulled back and restricted in some way. And when we get to Callicles, we'll hear of Callicles talking about convention smothering lions' cubs. These lions' cubs who have so much potential greatness or so much in their body, inborn, but are restricted by convention. So I guess almost the unchanging nature of fusus. So someone is just born with more of greatness or more capacity for greatness, independent of nomos. So it's independent of education. You can't educate it in, you can't educate it out. That's how nomos is broken. So that's the point of comparison between nomos, the convention of the human world, and I say objectivity advisedly, but the objectivity of the body, of what is born, and from that, people are drawn from the arbitrary nature of nomos into the unchanging objective nature of reality, or of capital N nature. So circling back to your earlier question about why is it through breeding animals, for example, and not through something else, some other observation of the natural world. My best guess is that it is because the unchanging nature of fusus, as evidenced by, say, someone's physical prowess or the physical prowess of a horse. There's something that people breed of a horse.
Yeah.
plus temperament as well. And maybe this is also a point of departure from just observing plants or the breeding of plants to animals as well. Certain animals have different personalities. And it is the observation of this inborn characteristic which breaks nomos eventually. Seeing that there are these things, these organisms, which act a certain way no matter the enculturation. I think that's the best I can do.
Yeah, cool, nice. Did you want to try to unpack? I also asked another question, and I don't know if this is just my inability to understand what he's saying, or it was actually just a fact that what of the book, what could philosophy mean other than an understanding of nature? How come he doesn't consider, how come that is kind of if you think about it almost mathematically, you're substituting in the right hand of the equal sign into the left hand variable on the left hand side of the in this case, on the right hand side says knowledge of nature or understanding of nature, or idea of nature is substituted for philosophy. How come does that question make sense? How come that is what philosophy is?
So can I, just to make sure I'm understanding the question correctly, so you're saying, why is it that an understanding of nature, in the sense that we've just talked about, why is that equivalent to philosophy, or why does philosophy grow out of that?
Yeah, and how come there isn't things in philosophy other than that?
I think, so we'll get to, when we get to Plato, we'll get into this a bit more, but probably my best interpretation, which I feel like I'll be saying a lot this episode, is that he's saying that the idea of philosophy, so this idea in Pindar of nature, capital N nature, of fusus, of these inborn characteristics within people or within animals, which are independent of the nomos environment that they are born into. This idea is not yet philosophy. This is a necessary precondition for philosophy. At least I'm 90% sure that he says you can't get to it other way. Let's just assume that this is a necessary precondition.
Yeah, just for the sake of...
But that is abstracted by Plato. So Plato takes this idea and generalizes it from just saying, oh, gee, isn't it wild that this particular horse just keeps giving birth to really good horses. Generalizing from that to a conception of an exterior world which exists independently of your particular nomos. So say a tree will continue to grow independently of your particular mythologies describing why trees grow or don't. There's something exterior to you. We'll get into it more when we talk about the Gorgeus, Callicles, etc. But I'm pretty sure what he's saying is it was Plato who took this pre-Socratic idea of nature and generalized it while also hiding it under a defense of conventional morality.
I guess a more simple way of putting the question would just be like, what does he mean by the word philosophy?
So what I think he means is, and he also does say the concept of philosophy evolved over time after Plato. I think what he's saying is basically an understanding of a world exterior to human beings, which is understandable, which is law-abiding in that it's not totally arbitrary. Like, you don't look for laws in it and then some sort of divine being says, well, I'm changing them now, and all of your prior assumptions are completely wrong now.
Yeah.
I think in general, that's what he's saying. And he's saying that view of the world is arrived at by, in the first case, observing that certain animals give birth to offspring which have their characteristics independently of the metaphysical environment or the ideological environment, the religious environment, the nomos environment in which they're begotten. I'm pretty sure that's what he means by philosophy.
A culture-independent explanation of the world.
Well, probably an attempted culture-independent explanation, because I'm not convinced there are culture-independent explanations of anything.
Well, no, like I mean, like
human being, but
an explanation is an artifact that has to be created by a mind. So, like, all minds are a part of cultures. So, yeah, sure, but like to the extent
important caveat, but yeah,
to the extent that you can create like an explanation that accounts for the thing without being dependent upon the culture of the person creating the explanation is what I mean by culture independent. Not that the explanation itself has somehow arisen out of something that doesn't have a culture. So
I was probably be more. I'd probably prefer to say, and there's just semantic quibbling.
Yeah,
an attempt at culture independence, because I think it's the in science, like one of the really important bits of science is it acknowledges that humans like make mistakes and approach things from a certain limited perspective. Like that's one of the things that makes it so powerful. Is that it acknowledges that and seeks to overcome it, acknowledging that like the observer is going to be observing from a culture.
Whereas I guess what he might have been saying is like other things being nomos dependent, other ways of thinking being like, I suppose, like explaining the world only, I guess, within the frame of reference of the particular nomos.
And then, not attempting to step outside of it, I think, because he talks so much about going into the wilds outside of the polis and outside of the city in order to see with greater perspective what's going on. I think that's what he means by philosophy.
Okay.
I'm not sure he specifically defines philosophy in this way, in a way that I would regard as just a useful way for talking about what he means. You're kind of piecing it together because he'll say, you're piecing it together from a few things, from him saying this is the idea of nature, this is how it is arrived at. Plato generalized this idea of nature, and in generalizing it, started our philosophical tradition.
Yeah, so
or at least because I'm pretty sure he would acknowledge the pre-Socratics. He doesn't talk about the pre-Socratic philosophers like Thales in this, but obviously he's going to be aware of them because he knows a lot about ancient Greece. My guess is
it's not like Democritus had anything useful to say.
My guess is that he'd probably say they were doing philosophy. They were abstracting this idea of nature. Plato's big innovation was, beyond saying everything is made of water or everything's made of fire. Which I'm aware that Thales wasn't quite as reductive as just everything's water. That's the end. But going beyond that, both in terms of the depth of thought, at least the depth of surviving thought from Plato, just we have a lot of Plato that survived, but also the project of hiding it is for Alamariu very important. But it's not quite the same as philosophy. Hence why I think he probably acknowledged the pre-Socratics, but he's not talking about them here, probably for brevity's sake, to limit how many different moving parts he has to deal with.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, that's it. The reason why I'm just trying to pin this down. Sorry, I don't mean to be like getting.
No, it's good to pin down because he doesn't define it. He gives you, I think, a path you can follow to get at what you think he's saying, but I don't think he specifically says
because I find that I get
is.
really antsy about people using words in the way that they're commonly understood, and if they deviate from a fairly well commonly understood use of the word, that they explicitly explain the way in which they're using the word, rendering the word, because otherwise you can just say whatever word is whatever you want it to be, and then all of a sudden it's like, okay, but am I arguing with your particular idiosyncratic, very niche, weird use of the word, or are you actually trying to give an account of what everybody tends to mean by philosophy?
I think that's
that's why I'm trying not to
completely reasonable thing to get irritated about. I think to an extent, it pisses me off. I'm more used to it. At the moment, I'm reading Difference and Repetition by Deleuze. And there's a lot of atypical word usage. Maybe it's because I've been reading a fair bit of continental philosophy the past year or so. Maybe coming from Deleuze and then reading Costin Alamariu, it's he's using words in a different way that I'm used to, but comparatively this is really tame.
Yeah.
So there's probably an element of that I'm going through a phase of enjoying really wacky philosophy.
I'm going through a phase of reading lots of programming books and I'm barely tolerating anything that's not very, very definitely defined.
I think it's also how much this is going to piss you off is also dependent on what you're approaching the book for. So I think I've talked about this in previous episodes. Long-time listeners will know I'm repeating myself, but I really enjoy reading books where an author sets out a system that is internally consistent. And if it's internally consistent and surprising enough, I can enjoy the beauty of the system. And I really enjoy that. What Alamariu is setting out in this book, it's not really wacky enough for me to... Okay, so something like Evola, for example, I don't agree that Evola's description of the world maps on very well to reality. But it's so deep, complex, and consistent that I really enjoy it. I find it quite beautiful, this odd system he creates. And so I can deal with unconventional word uses. I would prefer it if the authors say, this is what I mean when I say this word. It is conventionally understood to be otherwise, but I'm saying it with this specific meaning. I prefer it when they say that. If the system is consistent enough and they don't do that, but you can work out what they mean after a while, that's not as good, but I can deal with that. But I approach books that I read for beauty. Like, say, Decline of the West by Spengler. I'm reading the second volume at the moment. I enjoy that for the beauty of the system. Do I think that history is a succession of world souls developing according to seasons and an internal biology? I'm unconvinced, but it's a very beautiful system. But if I'm reading something to try to explain like how the world functions, so it's like if I'm reading something about the effect of breathing on the cardiac cycle, like I want that to be really specific. If I'm reading about antibiotic doses, like you better fucking tell me what all of these words mean, and don't just say, oh, well, I'm going to define dose differently, but I'm not going to tell you. Milligrams now mean something different. I think part of it too is there's a long-winded way of me saying I'll read different things for different purposes, and the extent to which I get really annoyed about being sloppy with terminology is also, it's calibrated differently depending on what I'm reading. Like I said earlier, Selective Breeding and the Birth of Philosophy doesn't reach the level of beauty that someone like Deleuze might reach in creating just this really alien feeling system. So I don't enjoy it as much in that way. I did enjoy it in that he's proposing a weird, like just a weird sort of shocking thesis and then spending a long time arguing it. I mean, I can appreciate it from that perspective, but the terminology stuff is a bit irritating. My biggest peeve with this book is probably in the introduction. He includes a graph. I think it's comparing, I think, genetic relatedness, and you know what I'm going to say, and behavioural similarity. Behavioural similarity on the y-axis. Costin, where are your fucking units on this graph? This graph is dog shit, and it doesn't mean anything. They didn't even put a percentage sign with behavioural similarity. It's like even the percentage sign without anything else would still be pretty meaningless. But I would have a better idea of what he was saying. But even then, it's like behavioural similarity. What is it? It's like what? 0.01 to 0.011%. It's like without the numbers on it, without any units, I don't actually know what this is showing. What if it's negative to positive? What if it's saying the opposite to what you're saying? I don't know.
And then he has the audacity.
That was where I got really. That was where I got really annoyed.
I mean, I just think that because then he had the audacity, like a couple of paragraphs later, after that graph, to say like, this what would you say, the tight correlation between groups and behavior is incontrovertible. Essentially,
it was a real Terence McKenna moment. It's like the pictorial evidence seems incontrovertible with my shitty graph, which actually has one functioning axis.
And then he went on to just make a correlation causation, he's just like, look at this correlation. And it's like, behavior. It's like, okay, but like if you studied maths at MIT, motherfucker, like you should know. Well,
that's the thing. He studied maths at MIT, so he must know that the graph doesn't mean anything. Like the guy probably does know a lot about maths. And also, not only that, there is just so much that goes in the social sciences into like creating quantitative models of human behavior, and it is such a young science, and it is there's so many questionable things, like the assumptions that you have to make, the way that you characterize, the way that you assert that your quantification, that the function, the quantity that you're assigning to a particular characterization of behavior does in fact hold, and that is consistent and valid, and that there's so many things that go into that like social analytic stuff, that to just throw one graph at it and then just like, this is like incontrovertible.
It's just
this was not like you calling it a graph is being too generous. Sorry,
it's a
because I expect
line.
for the rest of the episode I'm going to be inhabiting Costin, so I'm getting my venting out here. It's like it's not a graph; it was one axis plus a pretend axis.
And coming from a supposed like somebody who must be like experienced with like plenty of like at least undergraduate level mathematics, like he must have known that that's not up to scratch. If you're going to like base your opinion on the way that society should be structured on that sort of quote unquote evidence.
Like, you're talking about the social sciences and like looking at behavior. So this particular graph was trying to compare like
this was worse than the RBH graph.
It was comparing basically like it was meant to be illustrating a point of the heritability of behavioral traits. The thing is, it's like, I'm not averse to reading about, I don't know, if someone were to write a book about this, and like, there's been a lot of them.
Yeah, we need to read the bell curve.
I mean, yeah, sure. But, like, fine, I'll read about that. The thing is, it was like you were saying with the mathematical modelling and the assumptions in social sciences. That stuff's fine. Like it's you're analyzing a really complex system,
but you have to explain
and so
it.
In your analysis of it, just say like these were the assumptions we were operating on. This is how we analyzed the data.
Yeah.
Like that's all important, and it doesn't invalidate what's talked about. No. It's really important to know what those things are because that lets you actually interpret the data. Like there's probably something there that they're trying to look at, and so if you know how they interrogated these data and how they collected them, then like, you too can try to get at the fusus. You can get at the nature of it, and you can try to step outside of the nomos.
But my problem with it is that like he just
to just chuck it in and to say, yeah, look,
it's
this graph, which is not a real graph, means this, and I'm not going to elaborate.
It means this, except actually it's based on a bunch of like really quite like sophisticated.
It also wasn't cited.
It's not cited, and it's like in order to have a proper conversation about these things, like differences, like statistical differences between groups and like any genetic stuff and whatever, like that's not just a like hand wavy, just like throw it away sort of thing. Like that's a very sophisticated deep dive thing that you can go into, like unpack the assumptions, unpack like why are you saying these, like why are you explaining this correlation only in terms of a single cause, like how you haven't, like for example, like the tight correlation between like say even if you take as for granted like okay sure there's this like evidence that says like these groups have these differences, there's tight correlation between like this genetic difference and this behavior, it's like sure, but like what's the causal relationship? Is there a confounding cause such as, I don't know, like culture, like that? It just so happens that like people who are like have been in communities for a long period of time have also like had a culture evolve a long time. That's
almost as if there's a tight correlation between people who have been geographically isolated or clustered together and the culture that they form between themselves. But that's why it like this. Like, I'm not going to say, oh, you should never investigate this sort of thing. It's just, if you're going to do it. It's like you said, it's because someone's genetics and the culture they exist in, those things are so hard to pick apart, which is why when you present evidence like this, it's so important to, I mean, if we're talking about nomos, to present the nomos that you are approaching it from within. It's like the cultural context is so important because that's such a massive influencing factor that you're trying to pick apart.
But also there's a very straightforward, I can think of several very straightforward direct refutations of that. The first one being that I found compelling, I can come up with others, was that there's say like Asian Australians that I know, our generation, whose parents moved here to Australia maybe like 60 years ago, 50 years ago, or whatever. And so they're third generation immigrants, and their parents also like of the same race as their grandparents. And so genetically they're identical, like they're like of the same stock as their grandparents and great grandparents, but their behaviors are radically different. They're speaking English, they're like engaged on the internet, they're like doing all these Australian things, but they're, you know, their great grandparents came from like, I don't know, like Korea or something, like pre-World War One Korea or some shit, and like just behaved in completely different ways. It's just like, okay, so you have a completely different behavioral profile with somebody with the same genetic, like of the same genetic stock. It's like, okay, so what happened there? How come their behavior changed? And how come their behavior is so radically different to people who also have the same great grandparents back in Korea? It's like
you will not find me saying that culture is not important.
Like these two people have the same like person A in Australia who's of Korean descent in Australia, radically different behavior that is much more closely similar to an Anglo-Saxon Australian than a person who has the same, or is of the same genetic stock, who now lives in South Korea, who has like similar grandparents or great grandparents. Like that is this graph that Constantine like threw at us doesn't help explain why that can happen. You know, like,
well, I mean, I'm focusing on this graph a lot just because I think it's symptomatic of broader problems. But like, I don't take the graph seriously as evidence because, again, you actually can't interpret it because it doesn't have sufficient information to like. I can interpret what he's trying to say with it, but particularly without units, and without a methodology, it's hard to interpret. In a book like this, given that the book it's about a different thing than basically like race science. It touches on race science, but it's not the same. Given that that's the case, like I would be fine saying you don't actually need to go and spend 100 pages explaining your view of race science and the evidence that has informed it. However, if he could even just provide a reference for where the graph came from so that like if you're really interested in differences between racial groups, if you're really into racial crime statistics, you can look at a paper and find a methodology. Like that's
my problem is that
a lot of my problems are like you need to provide a little bit more context.
He's reductionist. He reduces human behavior to genetic, and that's not like I'm not being like.
That's not unfair.
I'm not twisting his words. Like that's in that paragraph or in that like couple of pages, he does reduce. And what I'm saying is like it's not reducible to genetics because the example that I just gave you of like a Korean or a Japanese Australian who's genetically the same as a Korean or a Japanese person, or you know, like pick your, you know, like Asian country, Australian Asian person, like same genetics as the person who's of the descent, but is like back in their like country of origin, is like how if human behavior is reducible to genetics, how come the like all Asian Australians aren't behaving like all their distant relatives back in their countries of origin?
Yeah, where did they pick up the drinking a flat Jack and Coke at 2 a.m. at the RSL and losing $50 to pokies?
Exactly. Or like, you know, any number of classically Australian is like, so he says that actually human behavior is reducible to and explainable by only in reference to genetic things, and then proceeds to say that this area of science is incontrovertible, throws a shitty graph at us, and then says like this has direct implications for all that. Like the weakness of his thinking and the fact that he thinks this flies for like, I mean, it's like if you like thinly veiled like racialism, like pantomime.
Oh, this is not thinly veiled. Like I will give him this. Like it's not thinly veiled. He's pretty open about it.
Like there's it's just like if you're going to like come at this subject, like I think if I put it this way, if you're going to come at this subject, you better bring your fucking like gun to the knife fight, like because there's plenty of people who have a different skin color to this guy who are pretty fucking smart and they're gonna rip you for it. And if you can't back it up, what you're saying, you just look like a cunt.
The way I interpret it was, it's like we'll get back to talking about the rest of the book eventually, but like I said, I want to have a bit of venting time before I go back to defending him. Like I interpreted a lot of the introduction as kind of red meat for the converted. It's like he's throwing out stuff that like if you already like this, you'll probably look at the graph and be like, oh yeah, that looks about right. The problem is like I'm not really one of the converted. In terms of the reductionism part, it's like this just sounds like such a fence sitter position, but I also think it's right. I'd be pretty surprised if genetics just had no influence on behavior, for example. Like, it probably does have an influence, but
it's not.
I would be really surprised if culture didn't have an influence too.
It's not reducible. The thing is, though. That's the thing.
Yeah, exactly. It's like I'm not going to say if you have a certain fusus, you're going to behave the same independently of where you're put. And to an extent, maybe when I'm being Alamariu bot later, I could try to offer a justification for this. But a problem I did see was that there are two parallel lines of argumentation which have a lot of crossover, but I think are actually separable and hard to reconcile through this book. So one is fusus refutes nomos by allowing you to, if you think about fusus enough, to step outside of nomos, because fusus is this unchanging inborn thing independent of your inculturation into nomos. Okay, so there's one. Two, the masses, and when we get onto the polis, so the ruling structure commandeered by the elite to get the demos to behave, but also to control members of the ruling elite to prevent instability. The polis will use nomos to control those with fusus who could overthrow it. But in doing that, there is the implication of enculturation, that you can enculturate those with fusus to cooperate, whether that is just by scaring them and saying, okay, well, culturally, we're going to hit you on the head if you do the wrong thing and if you oppose the nomos. But that's still enculturation. Yeah. It's crude enculturation, but it still is there. So
yeah, you're getting the culture to override.
One of my deep problems with this is there are actually those two strands of thinking which are very similar, which means that if you're squinting, it's hard to tell the difference. But I think they actually are separable and hard to reconcile.
Yeah.
Maybe later in the episode when I'm back to being constant, when I'm back to being Costin bot, I'll try to split that baby. But when I'm being Jack, I find that to be one of the really, really big flaws in this.
Yeah. Okay, cool. I think so. Can I just loop back to the idea of philosophy? So like we're talking about
yeah, we've taken like an hour-long detour. But it's important, it is an important question to this.
And yeah, like I try to like temper down just how I guess the thing is, Jack, like we've just read so many like racist stuff on this like podcast. And I'm just like like, all right, we're reading another thing about like some guy trying to like come up with like some obscure philosophical justification for his racial superiority. It's like, okay, fuck this guy. Like I don't have a huge amount of patience.
Yeah, look, this is a novel form of racism. I'll give him that. I haven't come across something quite like this.
Like maybe if this was like 50 episodes ago or something, I would have tried to have more patience with it.
Yeah.
But anyways, like with regards to that stuff that we were saying before about like philosophy, like what does he mean by philosophy? The thing is, like, he says the title of the book is Selective Breeding and the Birth of Philosophy. so philosophy started there. Okay, maybe you could say natural philosophy. Like what he means by natural, what people would normally say is like, so have you ever heard this idea of like, you know, modern science like evolved from natural philosophy? Something to this effect, which evolved from philosophy. And natural philosophy was that form of philosophy where, you know, like I think Aristotle had the physics or whatever. And that was them then trying to like come up with a philosophy of the natural world as opposed to just like mythological stories. Or like non-mythological explanations of the world, which then you could say is like natural philosophy. Maybe I could take the most generative or generous interpretation of what he means by philosophy as like natural philosophy. But in which case, like he would have to make the argument that like he says selective breeding and the birth of philosophy started with Plato, maybe a little bit before Plato, except like Democritus and the theory of atoms, pre-Socratic, like on, I'm pretty sure Democritus was on Crete, maybe, or maybe he wasn't on Crete.
I don't know where Democritus
but
is from.
like theory, like the originator of the idea of atoms and like decomposing the physical world into like little tiny subcomponents, like that's natural philosophy, and it's not in response to a biological phenomena. Like, how can he put, like, if he knows about it, if he's so knowledgeable of this, how come he can just ignore these other thinkers of the same region who are answering natural philosophy questions? But like, I just don't like it.
I'm gonna have to go back to being Costin bot now.
Please.
I'm back on the clock.
So confused. I just want an answer.
My guess with respect to the pre-Socratics, like I said earlier, was. So yeah, I agree with you. He didn't directly address this. My guess is that he would say they were living in a time of Greek aristocratic, like a Greek aristocratic nomos, basically, like that Pindar described. So they would have been aware of breeding and of nature, having been the descendants of the conquering tribes who conquered I think they're the Pelagian people of what is now Greece. And in conquering them, I don't think we've even talked about this. This is actually useful context. So what he says is that you've got the grain eaters in Greece.
The yeast people.
You have the conquering pastoralist tribes. They stomp all over them. And the pastoralists maintain a separation from the masses, and this is where aristocracy comes from. So you've got grain eaters, and they're on the bottom. They're the majority. They suck. They're all long-housed. They're controlled by old people and women. Everything bad you can think of, just attribute to these people. Then you've got your proud ketogenic. He didn't say anything about ketogenic. I'm just now being a dickhead. I'll stop. You've got then your pastoralists who, because of their understanding of animal breeding, maintain a genetic separateness from the people they're ruling over. So they only marry but among themselves. They only marry and have children with other pastoralists. Because of their understanding of breeding, they continue to breed themselves. This is where the aristocratic ideal comes from in Greece. And this is where their idea of nature arises from. So first from breeding horses or dogs or whatever, and then breeding themselves to retain separateness from the ruled. Democritus was, I don't know his background. I'm going to guess he was a ketogenic son of a pastoralist as well. I never realized the spirituality of ketogenesis. I've been listening to a bunch of Robert Breedlove episodes where he talks about ketogenic diets or carnivore diets and Bitcoin. And I've just been listening to them because I love the implication that these things are somehow spiritually, intellectually linked. Anyway, this is an aside. The ketogenic Bitcoin maximalist Democritus would have understood the idea of nature because he was of the aristocracy that had that idea of nature. This idea of nature was in Plato, probably abstracted. Okay, so this is what I'm assuming Alamariu would say based on this book. So it was in Plato's innovation was not so much discovering nature because that was present for Democritus as well. And Thales and Anaximander, all of the pre-Socratics. But it was both abstracted further and then hidden to become politically operative by Plato. And I think that's where Plato came in, and that was his big innovation.
Is
because a lot of this book is the story of Plato hiding the centrality of nature to philosophy and the fundamental link between the tyrant and the philosopher as the men of nature who will naturally rule over those of lesser natures. So he's hiding that. And then go forward 2,000 years, and you've got Nietzsche who uncovers it again, because those are the two big points in this book, Plato and Nietzsche.
So
Anyway,
maybe I'm misinterpreting what he means by nature.
Sorry?
Maybe I'm misinterpreting what he means by nature. Is he restricting nature just to biological, vitalism? He's not talking about a more
the idea of nature is from
the biological.
Observing breeding, observing fusus arising within nomos but being separate to nomos, and then, I guess, so this is capital N nature, lowercase n nature, the natural world, arises as an abstraction of that idea of nature.
Okay, because that just doesn't hold any water. I'm sorry, Jack. It's just that Pythagoras. Pythagoras is another pre-Socratic philosopher of the region who came up with a theory of culture independent truths and realities that abstract mathematical truths. And another pre-Socratic philosopher was Zeno, who came up with all these paradoxes about natural phenomena. So how can he possibly say that there's several very important, very famous pre-Socratic Greek philosophers who are asking nomos independent questions about the natural world, and there is no indication that they were obsessed with selective breeding, as far as I'm aware.
I'm not going to disagree with you here. I like the pre-Socratics. I find them really interesting. I think they actually did talk about things that weren't just pure nomos. I guess being my most generous read of this is that for the purposes of brevity, it's okay, you've got the pre-Socratics. The idea of an abstracted nature was growing with them. They were also part of it. It was in Plato where it reached its highest point and was then hidden so it could live and not be destroyed by convention, which naturally seeks to destroy fusus and greatness. Don't push me more of it. That's the best I've got. I can't.
I will drop it. I will drop it. I will drop this henceforth. It's just, I really think that if you're going to call the title of your book Selective Breeding and the Birth of Philosophy, you've got to account for the fact that the major philosophers before the person that you're talking about dealt with problems of philosophy without any reference to selective breeding. That's a pretty major thing that immediately jumps to mind. And I don't know how he was actually awarded his thesis if it's an immediate dude, it takes all of
there are theses which are way stupider than this.
Yeah, anyways, I will drop it. I will just
methodologically stupid. I guess for them, maybe for them, the idea of nature had already been sufficiently abstracted away from just concrete horse breeding. They'd already generalized enough away from that Zeno could talk about paradoxes without making explicit reference to breeding.
Okay, last question then. How come none of this came up in any of their writings then?
I don't fucking know. I'm being pushed so far now in terms of offering the most generous interpretation of this book.
I'm sure. Okay, should we move on to the next feature?
Costin bot now is just throwing up network errors.
Yeah.
Servers are under too much load.
You know why I'm kind of grilling Constantine bot on this is
because it's the point of this podcast. To understand these books, and you don't understand them unless you actually interrogate them.
But also the especially given his persona online, the implications, the normative and political implications of this explanation of the world are very obvious. Reading between the lines,
Oh, he's very open about them too.
It's like, okay, well, if you're going to hold that position, the explanation that you're using to from which, or in response to which you're creating these normative conjectures, that explanation should hold water. That should be a good explanation. And the fact that it's so easy to poke holes into it, and it's not even consistent with the history of Hellenic thought in the first place, like, I think is just like, it's so grinding. It's like, this is just a self-masturbatory project in obscure academic justifications for some like person's racism and I don't know, racism or racialism, like whatever. And it's like, dude, if like, man, there's lots of like people who have these sorts of things. Did you really have to waste a fucking PhD position at Yale to like do this? Like, couldn't you have just like, what the fuck? This is such a waste of like time and energy. And yet he's like created this, like, it's the you know, like when you meet somebody, and it's especially people with like PhDs in certain areas, where like they have very high linguistic intelligence, or like what would you say, like linguistic capabilities, but then they explain something to you and it sounds smart until you sort of start interrogating. You're like, okay, but that's a bunch of bullshit. And it's like,
yeah,
why do you like not Constantine, but like other people in like kind of like people that Constantine probably wouldn't like. I'm referring to PhDs and like kind of that like postmodern sort of stuff. It's like it's garbage, and yet you can create this because you're able to like adopt all of the linguistic signaling things that you need in order to like dog whistle to the other person that you're intelligent or that you're educated, but in fact your actual explanation of the world is garbage. And it's like, okay, so you don't need to actually be like smart in order to like have a shitty explanation of the world. Like being smart doesn't mean that all of a sudden, or like linguistically capable doesn't mean that all of a sudden you have like whatever you say is actually a decent explanation of the world. The reason that this matters with regards to this particular guy is because, like, what would you say? What turns me off about the entire thing is like, other than the racism,
just one thing
is like, I guess I got the like pervasive sense that this guy really likes the smell of his own farts.
Oh yeah,
like the entire time. It's like, okay, yeah, sure, but if you kind of like the smell, like there's arrogant people in the world, right? But there's arrogant people who can back it up. Like for example, like an all-star NFL player. Sure, fine, be arrogant, but you're amazing at what you do. But don't be arrogant and also be like, be so easy to tear apart. Like, like far out. Anyways, whatever.
Yeah, when you brought up the normative consequences of what he's talking about, I think we definitely should get back to that, but probably when we talk about Nietzsche, because he takes a lot of what Nietzsche say about morality very seriously, actually. And I think that'd definitely be worth getting back to. I just thought I'd quickly talk about the Gorgeous, this particular work by Plato, which is really central to his argument here.
The sophist.
So, the context within which Plato is writing the Gorgeous is that the Greek polis is declining. The Greek polis had been established by these pastoralists who have really forgotten their pastoralist roots. They conceive themselves as the aristocracy. And this is still predicated upon this idea of breeding. So they reproduce with each other. And that goes at least a large part of the way towards their sense of superiority over those they are ruling. However, When Plato was writing, it was during the decline of the Greek polis. And the polis, which basically existed as this breeding program to make genetically superior people, plus a training program of harsh discipline, war, education, physical training, to both further develop this greatness, but also to control it. And you had other ways of controlling it too. Like you had youth war bands that, like they'd go off and raid some places, form tight male friendships, learn bravery, learn strategy, learn some self-respect, and get the warring out of their system. They can come home and be stable citizens in the polis. All this stuff's great, really good. However, when it starts declining, what you've got is you've got this really unique situation where you've got these genetically superior men, and when I say, I just think of that fucking Black Pill video by Eggman where he's smoking in his car talking about when women taste the genetically superior man, it's over for beta males. And I can only assume he was talking about Greece in the time of Plato during the decline of the Greek polis, when you've got these genetically superior chads who have been trained to have this incredible discipline, this incredible physical presence, this incredible intellectual energy, and they're released from the discipline of the polis, which is now breaking apart. So you've got the peak of humanity who are just unchained. And so you've got people like Alcibiades who are globetrotters, Mr. Worldwide, rubbing shoulders with rulers all over the, not the world, but a fairly wide area around Greece, around what is now Turkey, around what is now North Africa.
The extent of the known world, it would have been like, up there. Like, it would have been impressive.
So Mr. Parochial Worldwide, he didn't have Pitbull's access to aviation, but he did as well as he could. So you've got this explosion of great specimens. And what Plato was responding to was a situation of both having all of these great specimens running wild, this great flowering, and also a population, a demos, the majority who resent greatness because it threatens them, and who, on the whole, create a nomos to protect themselves from great men, seeking to attack that. And so Plato is responding to a few things. His fundamental project is to preserve philosophy as viable. And because in this book, philosophy comes from an abstraction of the idea of nature, that involves also protecting breeding. And so Plato writes the Gorgeus, this book, the central dialogue in which is between Socrates and this young Athenian man called Callicles. Callicles effectively proposes a pre-Socratic vitalism, or a radical expression of nature, where he's talking about how what do you say? You have certain great people born with fusus. A lot of this is a repetition of what we've talked about earlier, who, if they are to understand their true nature, would be compelled, either as a philosopher or as a tyrant, to dominate the masses, the bastion of convention, because this convention always seeks to overwhelm fusus to protect itself. And you would dominate the bastion of convention to protect fusus so that fusus can continue. And this is where Alamariu is drawing this tight link between the philosopher and the tyrant. So the tyrant is basically the philosopher who enacts his, and I say his in a gender non-inclusive way because it's only dudes. The philosopher becomes the tyrant when he becomes politically effective, when he imposes himself physically rather than just intellectually. And Callicles' radical antinomianism is refuted by Socrates in an ironic way. And this is where the Straussian reading comes in, and where I don't know enough about Plato to say how valid this is. So Alamariu provides evidence for this. The thing is, there's been a lot of Platonic scholarship and no one's come across this. Maybe Alamariu really is onto something that just hasn't been seen for millennia, but maybe not. But anyway, what he says is that Socrates exoterically disagrees with Callicles and refutes him. However, his arguments are so pedantic, so nitpicky, and there's so much sophistry, which is not unusual for Socrates. Like, this could be said of a number of times Socrates argues with someone in Platonic texts. But what Socrates does is, instead of disagreeing with Callicles' central point, that nomos and convention smother what he calls lions' cubs, those with fusus, Socrates doesn't actually disagree with that. What he does is he slowly changes the subject of what they're talking about in a very Socratic way. So if people have read Plato, what Socrates often does is he just asks he makes a statement and then asks his interlocutor, would you agree with this? And just keeps doing this until he's just kind of changed what they're saying and then disagrees with that, provides the coup de grace to a position that they never really stated. So Alamariu first says, okay, so Socrates is doing this. He's not actually disagreeing with Callicles' radical antinomianism. Instead, what Socrates does is shames Callicles. What he ends up doing is he demonstrates that Callicles is not yet Callicles enough, and that Socrates understands the true radicalism of nature. So Socrates talks to two other people in the Gorgeous, and with both of them, he ends up defeating them, in a sense, by shaming them. So he makes them feel ashamed and they stop arguing. And Socrates, in this text, says that shame is used to cover over truth. When it comes to Callicles, Socrates ends up also shaming Callicles into silence. So Socrates has already said convention uses shame to cover the truth. He doesn't say the truth of nature, but we've got Costin Alamariu to read between the lines for us. So Socrates is actually saying that nomos uses shame to prevent fusus from expressing itself. I think he basically backs Callicles into a corner of saying that abiding by bodily imperatives or fulfilling bodily desires is a good thing, and then he says, is the life of a catamite, so someone who has anal sex with other men, is this something that it is good to fulfill? And Callicles is shamed into silence. He doesn't want to endorse homosexual anal sex. Which, funnily enough, is like there are a bunch of other Socratic dialogues where they talk a lot about, not openly about anal sex, but they're partial to it. It's like not even reading between the lines. Like
Straussian analysis of Socratic
the last
anal
half
sex.
of it is a bum sex. It's only a slightly reductive take, but so you've got this combination of Socrates not disagreeing with Callicles' central thesis, plus Socrates saying that nomos uses shame to silence truth, and then Socrates uses shame to silence Callicles. And through these, and then Socrates goes on to talk about how it is the political body in a polis rather than the demos, which ultimately wields nomos to control those within it. And he begins to make the case that it is a philosopher's job to provide advice in this context to rulers so that they rule well. And this is sort of the culmination of Alamariu's point about the Platonic saving of philosophy, I guess. So just assuming that what Alamariu has said is correct. So what you've basically got is you've got a Socrates agreeing with Callicles in principle and demonstrating to Callicles that Callicles is not yet ready because he can still be shamed by a nomos. And then Socrates goes on to exoterically provide a defense of conventional virtue while also saying you need philosophers who, in the background, understand nature, understand breeding. In the foreground, will defend public morality, will defend conventional morality, and provide that advice to rulers. So what Plato is doing is he's setting up philosophers as a group of people who, to those not in the know, are defending popular morality, so it makes people feel good. It makes people behave in a socially acceptable way for the continuation of civilization. But then esoterically, Socrates knows that if you read Plato the right way, you will learn the secrets of breeding. And the philosophers who are politically aware, who have been made politically effective by this Platonic masking, will be advising leaders and will be feeding them in secret these ideas of breeding, but publicly affirming conventional morality. And that's what happens in the Gorgeous.
It's a
position. Like it's so okay, there are a few ways to approach this. One way of approaching the explanation, which I did feel was
it's inventive.
Yeah, huge if true. It is pretty, like, if it's true, it's cool. That like Plato just saw so far ahead in the future. He was like, you know what? I'm going to write this book that is going to fundamentally change how human societies are run for 2,000 years.
Yeah.
That's cool. It's a cool idea.
It's like that sci-fi novel about what's that one?
Oh, like Foundation.
Yeah, Foundation. Yeah, the Foundation.
It's like
like Plato was the
Foundation.
Yeah, Plato was the eugenic. What was the guy's name?
It's like Isaac Asimov.
No, like the guy who does the precog stuff for the civilization.
Oh, Harry Seldon or something.
Yeah, Harry Seldon. Yeah. Or like Plato's, except he's into eugenics.
Yeah. Anyway, that's my best, quite rambling account of how Alamariu reads the Gorgeous.
Okay, so
and how he sets up Plato's project of the exoteric Platonism, which protects philosophy by making it socially palatable, and as a result protects those with fusus, because the masses, the yeast people, are willing to accept them because they now see those people as defenders of popular morality. Nice. But he includes like behind the scenes stuff on your Blu-ray DVD, which actually tell you about the secrets of breeding. Okay. And so you can keep having superior people be born so long as the esoteric Platonism is still understood. But big disaster. Christianity comes along and fucks everything up. Plato was a mega genius, but he couldn't have foreseen Christianity.
Before we jump into that, so back to the Gorgeous. Two quick things. Okay, firstly, very, very, and the third thing is related to the first two things. This is a very, 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 very long bow to draw.
No, I think this is pretty watertight. You saw how easily and how quickly I could sum it up, didn't you?
Very, very long bow to draw.
This is
very,
like
very convenient use of quote unquote Straussian analysis, and it's very convenient that it happens to align with Constantine's preconceptions of racial superiority. Okay. Secondly, it is
a lucky coincidence.
It's a lucky coincidence. It's almost as if he started with his racial superiority complex, and then he worked backwards to figure out his interpretation.
I'm inclined to think He used to be a blue-pilled soy latte drinking member of the purple-haired proletariat. And one day he was reading the Gorgeous and was like, wow.
This is the only interpretation.
Is Plato saying what I think he's saying?
This is the only viable interpretation of the Gorgias. Like, I'm going to completely up.
He's reading in his university library and just looks up, sees a black guy walking across in front of him, looks back down at the Gorgias and was like, what is going on? Just starts screaming.
The second one is like, the second thing is like, that's essentially a conspiracy theory, and and like all conspiracy theories, look, occasionally, like, it turns out that there was like, look at Gulf of Tonkin, or that
Epstein was real.
Or that, like,
you and I, as employees of Boeing, keep killing whistleblowers. That's not happening.
When I found out about...
I just want to emphasize, Levi and I have killed no Boeing whistleblowers.
There was a really interesting one just before the Yom Kippur War back in the 70s, like, Israel had a conflict with Egypt. But preceding that, there was actually, like, this false flag attack by the Israelis on the Egyptians. That was, like, what kicked off the conflict. And
that would be wholly unlike Mossad. I will not hear their good names.
And they didn't have, like, the evidence was like, eventually, like, came out and, like, took responsibility for it and stuff. It's like, so like, sometimes, like, false flags and stuff do happen. Nord
Stream 2 blew itself up.
But when you propose a conspiracy theory, like, you've got to have a really good reason why the thing that you're explaining, the best explanation is your conspiracy, and one, not just a result of, like, human incompetence or, like, accidents, or just, like, apparent order in a complex system, but it's actually, like, you're actually just seeing patterns when there aren't any there, or
sort of pareidolia.
Essentially, like, and more like generalized form of pareidolia, or like or why it's a better your conspiratorial explanation rules out, or why alternative conspiracy theories are ruled out, whereas your conspiracy theory is the most the hardest to vary and best fit candidate, and very few conspiracy theories, when you actually, like, start to get into these sorts of questions, withstand that sort of, like, analysis, and short of essentially, like, the person just believes it because they want to, like, essentially at some point it just becomes like the person's already made up their mind that this is what they believe, and it's like, well, you can't really, like, talk or reason with somebody who's just already made up their mind. It's just like, okay, well, I'm just, like, going to say, like, 9/11 was an inside job or whatever, and no matter what you fucking, or, like, it wasn't, like, there's this one time on YouTube, somebody was explaining, I watched this, like, guy in, like, like a trailer or something, explaining how, like, the 9/11, like, video was, like, fake. They faked it and it wasn't actually planned.
I've seen a lot of those.
And there wasn't enough, like, like, it was rigged with explosives and stuff. And I don't know, I was, like, 19. I thought I could make a difference in the world.
Thought you could make a difference in the world if you just slow down this security camera footage and look at this frame right here, this blur.
But also, I think at the time we were doing, like, physics or something. So, like in first year, and I was like, okay, but, like, if you actually think about it, like, think about how big a plane is, like, how much fuel they've got on there, and how fast it's traveling. Like, like, the physics of that is, like, surely there's enough, like, energy in that to cause the kind of...
There's a lot of energy in there if you slam it into a building.
In, like, how much does a plane weigh? Like, hundreds and hundreds of tons, if not more. And it's traveling
full of combustible fuel.
Full of, like, fuel, and traveling at, like, 1,000 kilometers an hour or whatever, 700 kilometers an hour. like smashes into the side of a building that was not designed to withstand that. It's like, and I sort of like tried to explain this in a YouTube comment, and just the responses that I got was just like, I realized like that was the moment as a 19-year-old where like the veil was like pulled back, and I just realized, oh, like some people, no matter what you say, like I can't remember what the guy, he just like some response just like completely, it's like didn't actually like pay attention to what I said. It's like it's like okay well I was like never gonna like engage in a conversation with like a 9/11 denier or whatever, because it's just you're just not gonna walk away from that conversation with any positive result, you know. So my question is,
you saying,
yeah, sorry. No, Oh, it's just like, okay. How does like Dr. Alamariu not just fall into that sort of like same category? Conspiratorial. You're not going to be able to like really talk reasonably with him. He's already made up his mind. This is the correct interpretation of the gorgeus, and the others are wrong. And like he's the one who can just see the correct esoteric interpretation.
Because I think he says that, we'll get on to Nietzsche. He says that Nietzsche actually saw this interpretation and talked about it. But Alamariu saw Nietzsche correctly interpreting Plato and then brought it to us.
Okay, so just before we go into Nietzsche, which I think is a good segue, but this sort of draws more generally, sort of round off this thing I was just saying before. It's like, I've a friend who's like a defense lawyer, criminal defense lawyer. I have another friend who's like a criminal prosecution lawyer, and I like talking to them about their jobs. Lawyers like criminal lawyers have really interesting jobs, and what stuck out to me talking to them about their jobs was that like it's really hard for the prosecution, because the prosecution, at least in Australia, I don't know what it's like in other systems, but here in Australia, the prosecution basically has to create an airtight case that the person who's standing accused did the thing. That's the best and only explanation, and all other possible explanations are not viable, and forces the judge and or jury, if it's being presided over by a jury as well, must kind of like logically forced into accepting this conclusion that the defendant is guilty, and it's this asymmetry, because the defense, their job is on some level easier, because they just have to come up with some story that could conceivably have happened and could still account for the facts, even if like when you hear it you just say that's a fucking bullshit story, there's no way that's true, the guy fucking did it, and like this like other just like, oh, you know, maybe there was other thing and this other thing and there's a contingent and then, you know, but that's the way that the system's set up, partially because like like in a country like Australia, like it's really important that like the prosecution actually like definitely have the right person. And I kind of view this like philosophy stuff the same way. It's like, okay, if Dr. Alamariu, if your interpretation is the interpretation of the gorgeus, like it has to be airtight, and you basically have to have given reasons and ruled out alternative interpretations, like, and to force me as your reader to think, not just battering me over the head with evidence, but actually like, no, like this other interpretation of like esoteric interpretation, or this mainstream interpretation, like all other interpretations are essentially ruled out, and this is the one that you're forced to adopt. And I personally do not feel as though, having read it, that I'm in that position now. You know, like I don't know. Whatever.
Yeah, I think part of it too is, and this is just a reflection of my instincts or first principles. And I suspect you're quite similar in that when I approach things like this, putting to the side when I read things for beauty, like I talked about before, it's good and oftentimes necessary when you're proposing some sort of philosophical idea to make some sort of positive claim to say this is how I think things are working.
Yeah, for sure.
But I also, probably as a result too of quite a number of years of scientific education, I want a lot of negative examples too. And I find those sort of negative propositions.
Sorry, what do you mean by negative? Like, can you give a simple example?
So suppose we're talking about it in the context of selective breeding and the birth of philosophy. So you've got your positive statements of him talking about how you get this idea of nature from breeding and abstracting this idea of nature to
here's our
philosophy, or maybe natural philosophy more broadly. Yep. And then when I say negative, I mean him considering other possibilities or attacking parts of his own thesis.
Yeah.
And even if he comes away from certain of those saying, this is not something I can resolve myself. Even just the act of demonstrating to me that he has actually tried to make negative statements about his own thesis. Is important, because it almost a more important thing than how do I have the right answers to a given question. How do I weed out wrong answers or get them less wrong? This might also be because I was born into a country which is much more of the British empirical tradition, where this is much more of a thing. I'm more interested in how do you develop a system of correcting errors, more so than a system of, well, how do I generate new positive theses about how the world might work,
and how do I bludgeon my reader into accepting
well, that's the most important.
It's like
rhetoric's the most important bit of everything, and then everything else is just less useful. You don't sell the steak, you sell the sizzle.
Yeah, and it's not just me, right? Am I being unfair? Like that, I just don't feel as though he actually did engage in that deep level of criticism of his own thinking or other considerations, and it did just come across as okay, this is I won't say alt-right because I don't know if but this is this whatever weird internet Twitter right-wing person's version of the weird left-wing Twitter person who also wrote a PhD that does exactly the same thing but comes to a completely different conclusion, because all they've done is they've said, I'm just going to provide a way, I'm just going to bludgeon my reader into accepting my point of view, or I'm just going to dog whistle to people who already agree with me.
Yeah. And granted, so I don't think that's unreasonable. An important caveat is a lot of my first principles, I imagine, are very similar to yours in that I reflexively, both are important, but I prefer a robust error correction mechanism to a way of just generating.
I guess the reason why I don't think that's necessarily,
I wouldn't even call them hypotheses.
A bad thing, Jack, is one, then we can have you and I can have disagreements on the show, and that's good. But also because I guess in principle, I'm not really against somebody proposing the idea of or even just calling attention hey, here's these racial, here's these, I don't know, behavioral or outcome differences between different ethnic groups or something like that, that sort of stuff. It's okay, cool, maybe there are. What could be the reason? And what, that's an interesting sociological and scientific problem and all this sort of stuff. And if you want to what would the word be kind of I don't know, bait people into having this argument with you online or whatever. I would like to see the person who's trying to do that is also engaged in the critical process of thinking through, not just assuming that they already know the answer to how to explain that phenomenon, which of course inevitably is that there's these racial ranks, and of course it always happens to be the person who's proposing the supremacy of like one culture is just like happens to be of that ilk.
Well, otherwise they wouldn't be smart enough to have these thoughts.
You know, like how fucking convenient.
It's all contained in the system.
But it's like, it would be nice if you spent all those years at Ivy League universities, or, you know, like elite universities. I don't know, like, I don't know if they're all Ivy League, but you know, like they're some of the world's greatest educational institutions of the entire global civilization. You just think like, come on, man! Like, how many years at these amazing institutions did you spend? And like, you can't have like the like insight or critical thinking to like do what you just said, Jack, around just having some sort of reflexive like deal with like the negative points. You know. Like, is that too much to ask of like a PhD from Yale? Like, fuck.
I don't like. I wouldn't think that it's too much to ask. But multiple things. Again, I'm very aware that this approach tends to be my default position in most ways. So, like, for example, in politics, I think probably a more useful thing to look for in politics, rather than how do we get the best leader, is more how do we get rid of leaders when they're not as good? Like, how do we get rid of bad ones? And I feel like that process of error correction is actually probably more useful than just, well, how do we get the best leader possible and just pick them and nothing else?
Oh, Constantine.
Of course, I'm not saying it's not important to get a good leader. Just in the same way as it's not unimportant to come up with new ideas. What I'm saying is I naturally prefer, well, how do we cull the bad ones?
Yeah, that's
and feel
so
like
interesting.
That iterative process is, over time, probably actually more useful to getting towards, say, whatever you're trying to optimize for. Because what you're trying to optimize for is itself, at least to a large extent, another culturally contingent value judgment. But
like Alamariu.
I tend to prefer that approach.
Alamariu is the literal complete opposite of that. He's like, how do we?
Oh, absolutely.
How do we
and he's highly Nietzschean.
How do we just
and like he's very open
breed a class of people to not make errors and then just give them all the power?
Yeah. Yeah, and a lot of this probably does come back to the fact that, like, I'm deeply enculturated into the liberal tradition.
Yeah.
Like, My visceral feelings about what is right and wrong ultimately do tend to come down to the taught morality of liberalism that I grew up with in Australia.
Yeah.
So I'm aware that I'm approaching it from that perspective, but
yeah, that's good to be like
also just seems like
sure.
Probably a more stable way to do things over time as compared to, for example, like a Nietzschean society, depending on how it is. Like, I guess we're just going to get into his idea of Nietzsche. So maybe I'll just explain.
Yeah, let's go into it. Yeah, the last part of the book.
Yeah, like I'll put a pin in what I was saying. He says, so Nietzsche saw that, particularly under the influence of Christianity and of Darwinism, these two things that are destroying Plato's project. So Christianity destroys it because Christianity embraces a superficial Platonism, so acknowledging that there is a spiritual world or some sort of perfect world of which our material world is an imperfect rendition or an imperfect shadow of it. Christianity doesn't understand the esoteric Platonism of breeding. Darwinism, so this also went for Bronze Age mindset. I'm not completely sure what Costin Alamariu's specific reading of Darwinism is.
Yeah.
Also because it has changed over time. Like, the Darwinism of 1850 is not... Or when was Origin of the Species written? Mid-19th century. I forget when precisely.
Yeah, 1850s, something like that. Yeah.
Something like that. But the Darwinism of the Origin of the Species, for example, is quite different to the Darwinism of 2024.
We have neo-Darwinism now.
What we have now is certainly based on the work of Charles Darwin, but it's meaningfully different.
Yeah, it's informed by like molecular biology and stuff now. Like,
yeah. it's almost as if over time this theory of
improved
Darwinism
the
was subject to criticism
and was
iteratively improved
Yeah.
upon. But
wow! Who would have thunk it?
And
it's consilient with alternative theories of other phenomena that it would have to be like congruent with. Like, wow, who would have thought that that's how to create knowledge about the world?
People can say, look, that's a value judgment, which it is. The thing is, like, if you're trying to make something which is predictively robust and with which you can change the world,
it's not just a value judgment.
It's actually really useful.
It's not just a value judgment, though. Like, the people who want to disagree with it have to explain, like, why the hell we can transplant, like, genes from, like, fluorescent jellyfish into, like, a rabbit and make the rabbit glow in the dark, and where did that information come from, and how did it become... you have to explain that shit.
Oh, yeah.
Like, this is no longer Darwinism is no longer like, it's not really natural because like CRISPR-Cas9 and stuff. We're using the unity of, like, molecular biology, genetic engineering, Darwinism to create technology.
Like, CRISPR-Cas9 is like, it's not even Darwinism.
Yeah, it's post.
Like, we've worked out a mechanism by which Darwinism operates, and then developed a robust enough explanatory model of that we can then, like, make rabbits that glow.
Yeah, like, and another one, we apply the same model of Darwinian, like, evolution, natural selection to, like, understand and create, like, designer vaccines to cancer, like, to a person's, like, specific cancer. Like, we're using this explanation to literally create, like, modern technologies. Like,
I'll try to be Costin bot here with the proviso that, so when he talks about Darwinism specifically, I can understand when he's talking about Christianity destroying the Platonic project. When he talks about Darwinism, so he says Nietzsche was responding to Christianity and Darwinism as threats to the Platonic project. Christianity for the reasons I just laid out.
Yep.
Darwinism because it presents a simplified view of nature.
It's pretty complex. It takes a while to understand.
But I don't quite know what he means with that. And so I just want to preface everything I'm about to say with, he basically, in talking about Darwinism as a threat seen by Nietzsche to the Platonic project, didn't expand upon what he means by...
I have a guess.
A simplified nature beyond, like, a sentence of just saying that.
I have a guess, and let me know what you think of this guess. And I'm going to try to be generous to to Dr. Alamariu.
No, that means I can be ungenerous.
Is, like, potentially... So there's this idea of, like, this vitalism stuff in, like, Nietzsche, maybe Schopenhauer, like... Darwin, and now like neo-Darwinism and all this sort of molecular biology stuff, like, there's no reference in that explanation to, like, life and becoming and vitality in the kind of sense of, like, Schopenhauer or Nietzsche or whatever, this life force, this, like, generative going out and becoming, like, sort of self-actualizing and that sort of stuff. You don't, at least in Darwin's account of nature and post-Darwin, like, you don't need to invoke that stuff. And so it's like, yeah, but what of the greatness of life? Almost like this existential stuff.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying? So it's
my suspicion was that it was based on a Nietzschean disagreement, because Nietzsche complained about Darwin a great deal. Yeah, so going from what you said, it would make sense that, at least as a possible explanation for this, what he's saying is, in Darwinism, it is promoting life as mere life.
Mere life.
An organism reproduces, whether sexually or asexually, has a bunch of offspring, and that's the mechanism by which its genes are passed on. And whether that creature reevaluated values, whether it lived its own life as some sort of artistic statement or not, isn't really important. It's just, like, did it pass on its genes?
Yeah, so life capital
So the life as life, maybe that's what he means.
I think that's what he means.
A simplified view of nature. However, he could have dedicated 5 sentences to this, and we wouldn't need to be saying... And this really important thing that he has identified. He said Nietzsche has responded to... or has uncovered a 2,000-year act of hiding on behalf of Plato in response to Christianity and Darwinism. And he doesn't fucking explain what he's responding to. This is actually really important.
I'm only making that jump in my conjecture based on Bronze Age mindset as well.
Okay, so I'm far from a Nietzschean scholar, but I've read a number of Nietzsche's books, and what you said would make sense in the context of Nietzsche.
Yeah, and like what Alamariu is interested in, like this problem situation. Like you could think of it as there's two types of life. There's life capital L, which you might think of just like reproduction, and there's life capital L in the Nietzschean like life as art or whatever. And Darwin's explanation of the world doesn't account for capital L life.
Yeah, I'd say so. Yeah, that's probably it.
So what is could you expound
what was I saying earlier? Oh, it was earlier we were talking about how I anticipate that Alamariu, other vitalists would probably point to what we believe. So some form of like some sort of scientific explanation of the world, something based on a combination of Popper, David Deutsch, Charles Darwin, that sort of intellectual tradition as value judgments.
Mm-hmm.
To a large extent, I view the world this way because my parents view the world this way. That's probably a big part of it. I went to university where you're taught to view the world this way. There, I guess if you stretch the definition of value judgment, which people who talk about, say, a Popperian understanding of the world oftentimes will use this, and I hope I'm rendering this generously, that it is ultimately, it's a human invention, these models of the world, how you're saying the world works. So there is no such thing as a gene outside of humans. There's some sort of reality, and humans come up with this story of a gene to explain it. And to an extent, like that's true in that I don't think there is an elemental gene exterior to humans. The thing is, we are in creating certain scientific theories, for example, making, you can call them stories if you want. It's not to say they're untrue. Stories can be more or less true. Making stories which have an increasingly high correspondence to whatever is exterior to us. Like you're asymptotically approaching it. I don't think human beings, at least with our current level of technology, we can't step outside of our senses or outside of our own personality to view it separate from that. But if you have enough people looking at the same thing, enough blind people feeling an elephant and communicating between each other what they're feeling, you're going to build up a story which has a pretty good correspondence to it.
Yeah, shout out to Plato and the elephant.
If you can, particularly if you can start demonstrating that this thing predicts stuff robustly, like with quantum dynamics.
Yeah, I think
quantum field theory. It sounds really wacky, but it actually predicts stuff really well, which says it's probably actually a story which corresponds, like it's corresponding to something. There is some sort of communication between these stories you're producing and whatever is exterior to you.
Well, the best explanation for why some explanation can make a prediction is that like there's some correspondence there.
So what I'm trying to say is that you can say, okay, well, what you believe too. Say if you're speaking from the perspective of science in places where science is a really useful tool for describing things. So say explaining natural phenomena. You can say, okay, well that too is a value system. Yep. It's nomos as well. And so it can also be threatened by fusus. But I just don't think that all stories or all forms of nomos are the same. So certain things just demonstrably correspond with the external world better than others.
It is a value
judgment. And especially, like, it's a value judgment, but what are you basing your value judgment on is also a question, because that's also not a uniform thing. You can base it on plenty of things.
Yeah.
And then if you get to the point of wanting to, say, if you take a step in the Bronze Age mindset direction, if you're wanting to impose your will on others, I suppose that's just what you're optimizing for. Generating a view of the world with a high correspondence to natural phenomena is actually really powerful. Like you can impose yourself better on others if that's what you want to do with this system.
Like intercontinental drones or something.
Yeah.
So there's a couple of things, like one, so there's this question of like the ontological epistemological gap, or the gap between like what the world actually is and our knowledge of that world. And a good question is like, is there a gap? And if so, is it bridgeable? And if not, to what degree, despite having that bridge, can our knowledge still be useful to us? Despite that gap, can our knowledge still be useful for us? And if there is that gap, like, is the pursuit of improving our knowledge futile, or is it actually something that's worthwhile? And sure, like all of those things are value judgments, but like I'm very clear about my value judgment. At least my value judgment is like what I'm trying to improve is my understanding of the world, and with the caveat that I know that my understanding of the world will always have errors in it, and I'm happy with that. But I think I can actually make a better, like over time, create a better understanding of the world if I adhere to certain like principles like criticism, or like the seeking truth, preferring seeking truth over like defending my pre-built beliefs or whatever. Like those are like, you have to take certain moral normative positions in order for this like scientific thing to like work. And to the degree that you don't do or don't adopt certain normative positions, such as like being willing to like adopt a better explanation if it turns out that your explanation gets refuted. Like you actually like most people don't do that. Well, it's also chaos. Like if you just say, you know what, I'm going to actually adopt, I'll be completely anormative. I will adopt no assumptions about the world. It will actually just be unintelligible chaos. If you can manage to do that, which I'm not convinced anyone can. In which case, it's like you're completely inoperative in the world. Like you're a dead end. But the question is then like, okay, but what are the mechanics of that then? Like mechanics, it's like, okay, like by what criterion should we like judge whether like one explanation is a better explanation than another? And like, excuse me, I know like a lot of big words and stuff. Like, okay, just like simplify it, or like to express it the way that I can express it, like the most straightforwardly, is like at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is we're trying to solve problems. Like we have questions about the world and we're trying to answer those questions, and some answers are better than other answers. And I'll give you one example, like here at home, like I was listening to an Aboriginal activist here in Australia, and I'm Aboriginal for first-time listeners. I've spoken a lot about that in previous episodes and like my experience with that stuff. And this Aboriginal activist, have a lot of respect for them in different for their contributions in other ways. But they said one thing that I found is that they're like, like maybe some people think that actually like people started here in Australia, like. Actually, Aboriginal people are the first people ever. And then like, it's like, okay, yeah, but like, wait a second, that's a claim about physical reality. And, if you, okay, let's assume that is the case. Like, let's just adopt that position. Okay, like, that presents so many other problems, such as, for example, how come we have this high degree of like genetic overlap with primates, which evolved in other parts of the planet? And how come like all of the mitotic genome, sorry, not the mitochondrial genome. How come, like, so for people who don't know, like your mitochondrial genome is like only passed through your mother, so all of your mitochondrial DNA is from your mother, and so you can use that to like map migration patterns and stuff, and it's really interesting. I think there are some other techniques. How come like all of these patterns emerge as we understand like the human genome and stuff, those patterns would be completely out of whack with the claim that humanity actually started in Australia. And that assertion has so many problems in it that it's just like out of hand. I can discard it as a viable explanation because it has no chance of answering that and a myriad of other questions that the actual like kind of standard explanation of like evolving in like whatever that like region of Africa and also like Central Africa and then like the migration patterns out and all, like that's the best explanation because it answers all these fucking problems.
It causes fewer problems.
But it does have other problems, but they're much better problems. They're problems that like help us like that we can, they're problems that emerge having answered a whole bunch of other questions. Whereas if I adopted the view that's like, oh, Aboriginal, like Australia is actually the place where all of humanity comes from, like it's actually Australia, all of a sudden you're going back down the stack. You then have to start building up the stack again of all the answered problems. And you actually have no way of doing it, you know? Like
it's almost like if you view it entropically. So water flowing downhill, it's going to find the path of least resistance. It's going to go down the most energetically efficient path it can find.
Yeah. That's it. That's
just what it does. It's almost the same way with explaining the world. Almost the more important question is how are you updating your view of the world? And if your updates of the world are the equivalent of pushing water back uphill, then if you're introducing more difficulty, you're probably going in the wrong direction. And when I say more difficulty, I don't mean saying things that run counter to conventional wisdom, because that doesn't have to be correct. So I don't mean introducing difficulty by saying things that might upset people around you. I mean more if you're being as detached as you can be, things that don't introduce intellectual problems, that don't introduce a greater degree of complexity or the demands for even more difficult explanations than are already present, then you're probably heading in the wrong direction. You're probably pushing water uphill.
Because the thing that these people when they come up with like especially for something that's as severely criticized as something like Darwinism or such as like the current standard model for the human migration patterns over the last like 200,000 years, like if you want to provide an alternative explanation, your explanation, like the standard is, this is the standard, this is how we know like when we can move on to adopt better explanations. Your new explanation has to answer at least all of the existing problems that have been answered by the current best explanation, plus more. And it also has to account for why the previous explanation is incorrect, but under the conditions of our previous knowledge, it's a good approximation. Like you have a tripartite like criterion. Then you have to answer existing problems, answer more problems, and then still explain why the previous thing was good enough given like the understanding at the time. And a very good example of this, is Einstein. Like Newton's theory is wrong, Einstein's is better. Einstein's theory accounts for everything in Newton's theory plus more, and we know that like without relativistic effects, so like when you're not too close to the speed of light, actually just using, or like you're not dealing with like very long distances, actually using Newton's theory is fine. Like it's a decent approximation.
Yeah.
So that's, Einstein's is an example that meets that tripartite criterion. So if some person who thinks that they can just say willy-nilly some fucking crazy thing that like just runs completely counter to our best explanation of like the fucking shape of the world, or like some important historical event, or like the migration of humans and like the evolution of like, or some shit, That's the standard that they have to pass. And it's a really hard fucking standard. There is a reason why it took humans thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years to come up with theories like neo-Darwinism. It's really hard. And just willy-nilly just throwing shit out there is just not good enough,
Yeah. What's that? You can do it. You're just wrong.
You're just
you're going to be
battle.
more wrong than the current.
And here's what I think, Jack. Maybe it's just because I'm getting too old for this shit, man. I'm just getting an old curmudgeon. It's like, if somebody wants to throw out a flippant theory, I am more than happy to just flippantly dismiss what they're saying if they haven't at least gone through, if they can't even acknowledge the problems that exist that the existing best theory accounts for. It's like with the example I was talking about before, the what would you say, Australian centric theory. It's okay, yeah, but you haven't even taken 2 seconds to think through the existing problems that the current best theory. It's okay, well, I'm not even going to listen to you. For this podcast, I will, because for the podcast,
because this is what the people want.
Oh man, sorry, that was very long epistemology.
Yeah, one thing it did remind me of in some ways is It was a combination of you talking about conspiracy theories and this book that did really remind me of doing when Ed and I did an episode on that Flat Earth documentary. It's something that I notice it's present in a much more sophisticated form in this book than in Flat by Hibbler Productions. But it's still a similar phenomenon where, with more conspiratorial thinking, in which I will use that term fairly expansively to include Plato 2,000 odd years ago hid the meaning of nature as breeding in an abstracted form in a defense of conventional morality to defend the existence of philosophers. I'll include that in broadly conspiratorial thinking, also with the caveat that conspiratorial thinking doesn't have to be wrong. There's just a particular genus of thinking, which is often wrong. It was similar in a fairly significant sense to the arguments for the flat earth, in that with the Flat Earth documentary, when it came to basically everything to do with the theory that the earth is a three-dimensional spherical object, or a roughly spherical object, bulging a bit in the middle, they approach it with this radical Cartesian doubt. Radical doubt. It's like, well, have you been in space and looked at the earth? No, you've only seen a photo, haven't you? So profound doubt, which is fine if you really want to get to the bottom of an idea. Trying to root out all these sort of assumptions it can be useful. However, when it came to the Earth, well, what we think of as the Earth is actually just a small area on an enormous, much larger flat plane surrounded by a gigantic ice wall, which can be located in Antarctica, but you can't go there because capital T, they won't let you get near it. When approaching that, suddenly this radical doubt just goes out the window. And it's like the doubt, which is actually it can be really fruitful, is just gone. It's nowhere to be found. The Antarctic ice wall theory is true. And if you don't agree with it, then you're probably just brainwashed. And so
that's a good point.
Oftentimes a really useful thing to look at when It's not just for more conspiratorial thinking, but it's useful in conspiratorial thinking particularly, is almost what's the density of doubt in different areas of the theory? What's the topology of the doubt?
Density distribution. The doubt density distribution. Of doubt. The triple D.
And that's often really useful. And so here, the doubt distribution, when it gets to say there are significant heritable differences in terms of mental attributes between different races. Like the doubt density there is very light. And then but the thing is, this is a useful way to analyze things. And it's actually really helpful.
It's really helpful.
And it really clarifies stuff. But then when And then also say Plato is speaking through Callicles and is using Socrates as a prop to both agree with Callicles and to deflect attention away from what Callicles is really saying for a yeast audience. There's not much doubt there either. However, when you get to readings of Plato which say, well, maybe Socrates just means what he's saying. Like maybe if Socrates is arguing badly, Plato just wrote that argument badly. There's a much greater density of doubt there. I'm not a Platonic scholar. Like maybe Plato regularly uses irony, and when I read Plato, I just kind of take his word for it. I take the exoteric Plato at face value, but it's often important to note what's the topology of doubt like within someone's intellectual landscape.
Yeah.
It's oftentimes very illuminating.
Yeah, for sure. That's a good way of I like that. That's a good way of putting it. Because actually under that schema, or at least with that sort of like mental model, you can definitely see that coming out with like a lot of pundits, you know, like whichever side of the political spectrum they fall on, like whether it's somebody like Ben Shapiro or like, I don't know, like to pick your like alternative left-wing like person, like like their topology of doubt is it's just like incredibly skewed. They just can't apply the same level of doubt to their own positions as they can so easily. All of a sudden people are just like incredibly insightful thinkers when they're criticizing someone they disagree with, but as soon as it comes to this is like all of a sudden it's like
well, that's why I think that's part of the reason why there's often a big asymmetry between how easy it is to have insightful criticism of things. And I think insightfully criticizing things is much harder than coming up with new ideas. And I say that acknowledging too, like on this podcast, I'm almost only criticizing other people's ideas. Like I write books where what I actually believe is much more present in them, but that's much harder to do. And part of that is because when you're criticizing other ideas, to a large extent, you're still operating within your own topology of doubt. You're not stepping outside of it. Whereas particularly to have ideas that generalize really well, you really need to be aware of what you doubt more and what you doubt less. I suspect that goes at least some of the way towards describing why criticism is so much easier than coming up with new stuff.
It's really hard. I'm writing an essay, or I've just written an essay on adopting the principle of parsimony, or like Occam's razor, to coding design, to like program design. So like the idea of parsimony being like don't let unexplained entities in your explanation, like don't have like a proliferation of unexplained entities, because those unexplained entities themselves need to be explained. Like you just have like an explosion of like ad hoc assumptions, and I was like, okay, well that sounds really interesting. Like what? Actually, I think there's something you could take from that when it comes to coding, because I feel like when it comes to coding and you're like designing a piece of software, like actually if you try to make not necessarily elegant code but parsimonious code, like how can I remove design elements, technologies, you know, chunks of the code so that I can get it down to as little code as possible to still solve the problem that I'm trying to solve. And under that, I was like, man, that's a really good idea. I think that's a great idea. I'm going to write an essay about that. And then I wrote an essay, and I'll publish it at some point. And then I thought, okay, well, actually, can I come up with 3 criticisms of that idea? Can I come up with 3 paragraphs where I consider like when would this quote unquote principle, or this proposed principle for like software design not apply? And actually, it was hard, but then once I came up with it's like, oh, actually, like try to have some detachment about the thing I've just wrote and try to actually come up with like genuine criticisms. It's it's really fruitful. It's a really fucking fruitful thing to do. Like you actually realize, like, oh, actually, no, that there are situations where maybe this doesn't apply. I'm like, okay, maybe A, B, and C, and all it requires the person to do to like literally, all you have to do is think like, when might the thing that I've just written or proposed, when doesn't apply? Like, how could it be wrong? Yeah, I don't know. Anyways, we've been talking a lot about this tangent on epistemology. I think your way is really
it's pretty useful.
Really useful. Yeah. So, was there anything else to say about the Nietzsche stuff? Nietzsche?
Not really. I think Nietzsche's main role was in uncovering this project, and then it's useful. So, bearing in mind Nietzsche, his ideas on where morality comes from, overcoming morality, forming new moralities, and the purpose of forming new moralities is useful in understanding where Alamariu is coming from. In the introduction, Alamariu talks about how much he loves nature, how all his work is really a response to nature. Actually, you were saying earlier about the normative implications of this book, and I said that'd be useful to leave until we get to the nature part.
Yeah.
Because I suppose the normative implications of this book are that it would be better to have a society that, rather than one seeking to improve the material quality of life or the comfort of the masses or of the ordinary person, it's better to have a society which exists where basically the mass of people exist almost as soil or material from which a handful of superior people can grow, who will, create amazing new things, whose lives will be works of art, who will charismatically reevaluate values and lead the masses behind them towards some new morality. From both the contents of this book and also a more Nietzschean view of society, I suppose those are sort of the normative implications of a lot of what he's saying. And that process of having a society to create superior people involves breeding. It would involve some form of eugenics.
Selective breeding, yeah.
What form that takes, he seemed kind of agnostic on, because in the introduction he pointed out a number of different strategies of breeding and said that breeding is always present. It's it doesn't there's always going to be some sort of process by which people choose to have children with one another, unless you were to have a society which just randomly assorted mating partners.
Yeah.
I guess that's a way out of it.
Just a lottery.
Yeah,
lottery.
Unless you're just trying to have noise as a mating strategy, which is kind of it is literally an arbitrary thing to do. I guess that's the point. But apart from that one kind of unlikely situation, he says, yeah, you're always going to have some sort of selective pressure. You're always going to have breeding. It's just what is being bred.
Yeah. What is the system? What's the output? What's the quote unquote quality of the stock being output by that selective breeding regime? That particular society.
He did say that at least under the current model of love marriage and being able to pick more or less, within some constraints, the partner you want for children, you're getting a divergence in that poor, stupid people have kids with poor, stupid people, smart, rich people have kids with smart, rich people, and so you're getting just this divergence of human stock. And then, interestingly, actually, and I think this is where he opens up some really interesting questions, actually. He says, what's this going to look like when genetic screening gets better? And that is an interesting question, actually. What does the human genetic stock of a group where you can... So suppose you have really effective... you have both a really effective prenatal screening program, embryo selection on the basis of a much deeper understanding of human genetics than we currently have. What does that do to the distribution, say, of desirable or undesirable traits in society, what does that do to the genetic diversity of a human population?
Yeah, well,
that's a really interesting
What does it
question.
matter if we've got gene splicing? Like, can't you just have your child do some IVF with the person and just get rid of like the genes that you don't like?
Yeah, but that's a really fascinating question. Like, that's not a what does it matter? That is
no, because okay,
really
so I know it's an interesting
like,
question, but what I mean is like, if you just focus on the screening technology and the use of that to filter, without also like taking into account that we have like the modification technology as well, like that's very different. Because then you say like, well, maybe you just end up in a situation where like, you know, like Gattaca, where people just like before they actually have a child with somebody or like date somebody, they want to see their genome test. It's like, okay, yeah, but what if you do the genome test, you say, oh yeah, this person's got like, you know, one of the alleles for Huntington's disorder or whatever. So, okay, well, or just
get rid of it,
splice it out. Like, it sort of ameliorates.
But that's really interesting, and that is so it's not. I mean, in some sense, it's breeding, but it's
it's the most selective breeding.
You're selecting actually like the subcomponent of breeding that I'm assuming Costin Alamariu really cares about. You're homing in on this individual component and just going all out.
In fact, I'll go.
But the effect on society be fascinating.
I'll go.
My guess is humans would turn into effectively a Monsanto crop, because you'd have like a handful of genes that are socially desirable, like. We find one that makes you more intelligent, or one that makes you less likely to commit crimes, which would probably strongly correlate with agreeableness or conscientiousness or something.
Die of some disease.
And you'd get, it'd be a human Monsanto crop. You would get a genetic bottleneck, and then there'd probably be some sort of disease which just happens to affect people carrying these particular genes worse, that fucking wipes you out. It'd be the equivalent of some, I don't know, boll weevil that just loves the taste of one particular monoculture crop.
Yeah, except the difference.
Or interestingly, you could get societies which, instead of there being almost a variety of different character traits, which to an extent moderate each other when you deal with large numbers of people, you just get a really extreme society where a proportionally larger and larger group of people just have this one particular thing that predisposes them to behave in a certain way.
Yeah.
And you get like wacky societies.
So the thing is, like, I think that like being successful in a complex civilization is not a single variable problem. So like, I think that rules out the monocrop concern. Like, there's not just
I disagree with that. I think
there's not just one.
But in terms of the monoculture thing, it's not about does it actually work. It's about do people think it works. And I guarantee, if it were legal, and even if it were illegal, but you had people saying like, yeah, we've got some evidence that people who are more successful have this particular gene, and we can modify your kid or splice it into the embryo.
Yeah.
A lot of people will take that up. It does not matter if it's effective or not. What matters is it advertisable, and politically can people be convinced?
Yeah, but
that's the most important
thing. Is though, is that like with a particular gene, like it might skew towards one way, but like there might be another variant of the gene that gives you like a better optimization in a different direction. And so like it's not like even for a single gene.
And when that's discovered, people just do that one.
Like, but they might be like, how would you put it? Like competitive, but not along the same like axis of performance. So I don't know, what could be like, like something that affects muscles, for example, like, I don't know, muscle tissue. Like maybe, one variant can make you like have your kid will have higher like like explosive power with the muscle, but like this other variant of the same gene might make them more flexible. Oh, what the fuck do you want your kid to be like? Like an Olympic lifter or a gymnast? Like what's like.
Oh, absolutely. But I still think like within different cultural groups, like there tend to be clusters of things which are valued more highly than others, which are more prestigious. And you probably would pretty quickly have people homing in on like a group of maybe 3 or 4 things that are, these are the base character stats that are currently prestigious or we think are associated with people being prestigious.
So do you think it could like allow certain like...
You've got to separate out scientifically if you think something is going to be effective or not, and then how people are going to behave in a mimetic, prestige-driven economy.
So they might like... You might have subcultures that like take a liking to different like genetic optimizations, and so you'll have like this like stream like of indefinite improvements in different subcultures along like down to the gene level of like optimization.
And it also depends on, so can you do this? Is this only really viable to do with an embryo, or can you do it in an adult?
I hope you can
human?
do it in vivo in an adult.
Because then, well, you're just in Nick Land territory.
Because I do it.
So this
I want to be like.
I found this is one of the more
like
interesting bits of the book, and he just kind of mentioned it offhand. But what does it look like? What does breeding look like once you bring in like genetic interventions?
And then also like, what does it matter about like ethnic groups as well? Like if you can just like, it's like, okay, well, like me and my wife, we're African and stuff, but like we want to have basically the same genome, except we want to make it so that they've got a different color skin or something. Like then ethnicity just becomes like packaged up. Like, how like Asian or like how black do you want your kid to be? Like we can splice these things into them.
And you would probably see most people would opt for whichever option was most socially prestigious in mainstream culture. Then you would probably get holdouts where it's like, no, my identity is like, I'm super white. And they would just try to optimize for being...
You heard it here first,
like,
folks.
I'm going to be mega Han
Quote,
Chinese.
Jack.
Like, I'm going to be the most Han person ever. You get that. Then you're getting into Nick Land territory where he talks about the hyperspeciation and things like that, where he says, race is just not going to be important because you're going to have face tentacles. Like, who cares if someone has like bigger or smaller eyes?
I just want my kid, I will splice in whatever fucking genes make like Pacific Islanders and like Maoris and stuff so fucking athletic and huge. That's I want like my kid to like have most of my genetic characteristics, but then just be like Jason Momoa.
No, I'd want the opposite. You know how people... Well, there's a group of people who like play Dark Souls, Souls level 1, broken sword only, no armor. That's the equivalent of just trying to load up your kid with the most dysgenic shit possible. And then see how they do in life.
Just like...
For bragging rights.
Like, or like Ghost Fallout or some shit. Just like, can I just put this radium next to my IVF bottle for like a couple of days?
Well, yeah, look, that's genetic engineering too. It's just a bit uncontrolled.
Outcome, sort of thing.
You don't know which mutation's going to show up.
And so that's another interesting question. I know, okay, let's say this hyper-optimized genetic bio-design future of like designer babies and stuff. It's like, wouldn't there also be like a competitive advantage in like exploring the search space in terms of like also trying out like variants that have never been tried before?
Probably. I expect that'd probably be what a small number of people would do. Just given the preference that most people have most of the time for doing what they're now doing.
Pretty big risk though, don't you reckon?
Very few people will do that.
Like, hey, because like say you're the first person to try a new variant, right? And the only way you're really going to know what effect that is to like have the kid. Like you can make predictions, but you don't know what that gene is going to do once it's actually interacting in the rest of the organism, unless you actually like put it in there. So like it's
like taking dark web psychedelic research chemicals. Maybe you'll have a great time, or maybe you'll fucking poison yourself. But someone's got to do it.
Maybe there'll be like, do you reckon there'll be like seafaring, like hyper, what would you say, like ANCAP fucking communities out there with like little like pens of like abandoned like biodesign children that just like got shitty fucking new novel variants that didn't quite work out, like 3 arms and
throw
stuff.
them overboard. That can be the underclass.
It's like in Knights of the Old Republic, like Underground. You know, did you ever play that game? Like Underneath the Citadel.
I never played that one.
Fuck, man, it was so good. But yeah, like Underneath the Citadel on whatever the planet was. I can't remember what the planet was. Like they have so it's like there was the old city, and then something happened. There's some catastrophe, and then they built the new. Oh no, maybe it was just like the sprawl of the city. They like covered the entire planet in a citadel, and so they had nowhere else to go except up. So they just started building the new city on top of the old city, and like all the old citizens are living underground, and they're all like mutants and shit. Yeah, that'll be like that's the future. That's the future of this planet. It's just we're going to have a multi-level metropolis just covering the face of the planet. There's going to be no more nature. We're just going to like artificially create all of our nutrients and have a bunch of like fucked up IVF babies living under the surface of the rest of the city. That's the future.
I think, as we've amply demonstrated, there is a unity to all knowledge, and it all leads back to Meltdown by Nick Land. No matter what you do, if you pursue it far enough, you get to the techno-capital singularity.
Just weirdly enough, like I think that Nick Land is probably the most like of all the people that we've read who make predictions about what the future's going to be, I would be putting my money on Nick Land for now.
He's certainly probably the most interesting person we've covered. A lot more interesting than Costin Alamariu. Because this book is, like, I've basically said all I have to say about the book itself. Because the book, it's kind of, maybe it's because it's graded on a curve, in that I knew this was a doctoral thesis. So in the context of doctoral theses, it's quite readable. And so I didn't dislike it. And I found it sort of amusing, the idea of Plato playing 10D chess and making this millennia long this hiding of the true reason for philosophy, to allow philosophy both to exist and to rule. Like it's a cool idea. I find talking about like pro-white racism pretty tiring, both in general and just because on this podcast it keeps, like, books people want us to read, it keeps coming up there. So that aspect, I almost just like screen it. It's like I've got noise cancelling headphones in my brain now. You know, like noise cancelling headphones have a microphone to listen to ambient noise and then make a wave that's the exact inverse of it. So you get wave interference and it cancels out.
Yeah.
I've almost got that in my brain, in that I'll just read blank spaces when he starts talking about like white people being better. But it just is not as, it's not as wacky as Nick Land's work. It's not as inventive. It's not written in as fun a way.
No.
I don't think it predicts the future in the same way. In that, do I think we will reach a perfect techno-capital singularity where humans are an inefficiency and we just dissolve into this absolute deterritorialization? It's like, I don't know. Maybe it's a hard future to imagine. Maybe it'll happen, but
so
maybe not. But it's a lot more interesting than this.
Yeah, for sure. So two things. One, I feel like I really need to reread Meltdown to show, like, because that melted my brain. And maybe we should do like another Nick Land text at some point. And I just
another one.
I was like, man, I'm just like not like on the level for this like right now.
I reckon. So I'm currently reading, like I said earlier, reading Difference and Repetition by Deleuze. I've got coming in the mail still Chaosmosis by Guattari, and I've got Capitalism and Schizophrenia. I reckon at least once I've read a few things by those two, we should do more Nick Land, because once I've done that, once I've got a bit more of a grounding in what Nick Land is basing a lot of his ideas on, I think then it'll be both much easier for me to read, and we'll probably get more out of it. And because we are committed to delivering value, our listeners will get more value out of it too.
The last thing is, do you want to like have a quick discussion about the rising youth right, or do you want to wrap the episode?
Yeah, let's talk about that. Part of the reason, that's why I brought up the like, I don't have too much more to say about this book, because it's like some of the episode specific questions we have, like the stuff that touches on heritability, race, stuff like that, I just can't be bothered talking about. I feel I've talked about it enough.
Well, we also touched on it during
today.
the episode. Yeah, it's fine.
Yeah. Rising youth right is interesting because we talked about it a bit at the start of the episode, but in the introduction to this book, he has a brief section on the youth right that he says is rising. And he says that part of the reason why left-wing and conservative commentators don't describe the so-called far right effectively or don't understand it is because the far right is not a monolithic entity.
Yeah.
And
sure.
yeah, fair enough. I'm not an expert on the far right, but that would make sense. So he splits it into three parts. He says there's the part that's getting politically or having the most political success at the moment, which is basically a reaction of ordinary people to a world where national identities are being dissolved, where those people are getting poorer for economic reasons, for inflation, like melting away their savings, for large-scale immigration, degrading their sense of community. He says that's the most politically potent group in Europe, North America at the moment of the so-called far right, at least as a conventional commentator would call it. He then says there's another strand, which is the old, just out-and-out racist group. So like former Klansmen or current Klansmen or something like that. And he says this group is old, small, politically powerless, but the media loves focusing on them because they're really sensational. And so that's one of the reasons why the far right is poorly understood, because you've got this one group which is pretty insignificant but is focused on a lot. You've got another group which is having political success but is more reacting to getting poorer. And then he says is the third group, which is the most interesting group and the group that will be the most they'll be the most significant, they'll affect the most change long term, and that's the youth rebellion. He says the youth rebellion has come about in large part because since the 1990s, he says, at least in the American context, schools have left behind the classical education, so focus on learning about literature, philosophy, science, logic, etc., and in favour of that, focused on a postmodern curriculum which is largely interested in critiquing structures of power, particularly with respect to race, sex, and gender. And students feel they're not learning anything in that. This system marginalises young men. And then we live in a culture which at least superficially still valorises rebellion. Youth like rebelling and like irritating their elders. So what do the youth do? They look for the things that they're told, well, these are bad things. What are those things? Race science, Nazism, nationalism. He says this is combined with an explosion in our understanding of genetics, and particularly as they relate to humans. This is where the dog shit graph that we complained about for like an hour came up. He says a combination of these two things is driving a youth right-wing rebellion, which is largely online at the moment, but will increasingly break through, and inevitably, he says, like break through into the mainstream and start affecting widespread change. That's a brief description, I think, of his point about the genesis and the future of the youth right-wing rebellion. As to how likely it is to affect widespread change, it comes back to what we said earlier, how it's really hard to tell or to gauge how much does energy or frequency and vehemence of posting on online message boards correlate to concrete political action. I don't know. At least from my brief interactions with right-wing Twitter, particularly with Greek statue Twitter, which I think is really the youth rebellion that Costin Alamariu is talking about. I haven't really seen a tight correlation between how passionately people write things on Twitter or how passionately they talk about the cathedral in podcasts and how much I actually do shit in the real world.
Yeah.
Furthermore, it's a very defeatist ideology. So you have people like Curtis Yarvin, for example, is he's Greek statue Twitter adjacent, and Costin Alamariu would probably include him in the youth rebellion, or like one of the older leaders or thought leaders of the youth rebellion.
Would you say an elder of the youth rebellion,
an elder statesman, leading the youth astray, the modern Socrates?
Probably only like 35 or something.
much of what he says is pretty defeatist in that, one, I think a very valid criticism of Curtis Yarvin is that he likes to theorize. That's useful. I think theorizing, coming up with new models of how the world works is useful. However, he seems completely uninterested in any practical application of what he's talking about. The application of what he talks about is basically, well, we just need to find the super CEO, future monarch of America, and install them, and then it's going to be great. Like,
haven't heard
job
that
done.
Political theory before.
Mission accomplished.
Yeah,
and like when I hear like that's just such fucking hand waving. Like he says it was like we were just talking about earlier, how it's much easier to have incisive thoughts of criticism of someone else's beliefs. He does have some really interesting criticisms of liberalism, and I'll definitely give him that. It's just when it comes to, okay, well, what do you do in the real world beyond complaining about the cathedral? How do you bring about a society that you want to live in? It's like, oh, well, Caesarism's just round the corner, mate.
Yeah.
It's like, well, that's a cop-out.
Yeah.
It's
like the same thing with Mark Fisher.
And with many of these youth right people, maybe it's coming. Like maybe it's in the works, and they're almost at the stage where they theorize about concretely, okay, how do we organize in real life? When they do what they complain about the left so much, but they have a lot to learn from the left, because something that the radical left is really good at, and that they talk about a lot in, like, they publish so much stuff on this. How do you organize in real life? How do you get groups of people together who believe the same things to then go out and educate other people about what they believe? And then once you've got these people, what do you do to impose your political will upon everyone else? Like, the left's good at talking about that. They've got a long tradition of talking about that. With these youth right, like new right people, they haven't learned those lessons. It's almost all criticism, which is fine. There's definitely a place for criticism. Then when it comes to concretely, how do we convert our Twitter energy to real world energy? It's almost all everything stacked against you. The world's fucked. The cathedral will block you at every point. You've just got to wait until your Caesarist figure emerges and smashes your enemies, and then it'll be good. And that kind of sums up how I feel about the rising youth right. Maybe people who are just more part of this world, and great, like, I'm 31. I'm not of the youth. I'm not of the right-wing youth. So this could also be that I'm too far away from it. But at least from my interactions with this world, it doesn't seem ready for prime time yet. Maybe it'll come, but it's not there yet.
Yeah.
Anyway, I've had a long rant. What are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, what you said about Yarvin, a lot of theory, but when actually like the rubber hits the road and it's like, how are you going to implement these things, these ideas, is a bunch of hand waving. You see the same thing on the left a lot as well. You see like Mark Fisher was like that, with these good critiques of capitalism, interesting critiques of elements of modern capitalism. But just everybody kumbaya around the fucking fire because of they're united by the common goodwill or whatever. It's like, nah, that like...
Well, not even that. It was even worse. He was like, no, we need to rediscover the will of the people, mate, and impose that. It's like, no fuck
like
off,
that's
mate.
actually...
Like, I'm not on board with that.
Okay, you've spent 400 pages. Maybe the solution implementation plan also deserves like another 400 pages. Like, maybe go write that book as well. Like, that's a pretty important part of like the follow up. So like,
I would say that ultimately that's the most important.
Like, okay, criticism, check, clocked it. All right, now what? Okay,
and the criticism bit, it's not only because it's easier that there's so much more criticism than concrete, forming concrete plans. And again, criticism's important because it's part of the updating process of how do you refine
I'm
a set
fully
of
down
beliefs.
with criticism,
But you still need something that you're updating. Like there still needs to be a hypothesis that you're updating.
Yeah. And sorry. Yeah.
Part two of the preference for criticism is probably because it's more cathartic, in that it's nice to shout about how much you don't like something. Like that feels good.
I think it's really good. I think people should criticize things.
Yeah. And it sells well.
Yeah.
Like if you're pissed off about some shit in your life and someone comes along with criticisms that can be really incisive and have a high degree of correspondence to the problems in your life and explain them, then like you're going to read that and say, yeah, nice. This really does explain some of the problems in my life. But
there are really
sorry,
there are like I can see the appeal of somebody like Dr. Alamariu because like I think I briefly shared this story before, but like when I was in Pittsburgh, old steel and aluminium city, like kind of like post. Kind of like Detroit, like people know about Detroit, like old car industry, sort of fallen off the wayside a bit. So Pittsburgh's sort of the same. Bit of a renaissance recently with like some of the medical stuff that's going on. It's pretty cool, but like, like it's got its issues. And I was staying with this white family, couchsurfing.com, back in the days before I could afford Airbnbs. Cool experience. Anyways, like it's Italian, like white American of Italian descent sort of thing. And the son was our age at the time. This was like years and years ago. And he was explaining to me, it's like, like as a white male, as a white dude, like constantly being told like how like shit we are, basically. It's like, I didn't do anything wrong. It's like, it's been hard for me to like get my, it's like, like what the fuck? It's like, but, it's like, you can't be a white dude in America, like we're just being shut on all the time. It's like, but there's plenty of like white people, but in this case in particular, like lots of young white men who are really struggling. Like it's like there's a lot of economic issues depending on which part of the country in. If you're in like Louisiana or something, it's like, God forbid you come from like one of those communities where like like the term redneck, right? Like I don't like that's not a nice. I'm pretty sure that's not a nice thing to call someone.
No, it's not a nice thing.
It's like, but you can make fun of. I don't know what the proper term for like the people who you like. I think there's actually like they're of French descent or something. Like there's a proper word. Like there's a word. It's like people call like the Romani gypsies and stuff. It's like okay, so it's like maybe we shouldn't call them gypsies, but like all right, whatever. Like I think there's an analogous term to like Romanis for like rednecks in Louisiana. Correct me if I'm wrong. And
there's some sort of exonym and endonym.
Yeah, and I was thinking like
I don't know what it is.
Okay, you can get up on stage and like you can trash talk the fuck out of rednecks if you want. All right. And they can't defend themselves. But there's like, look at them. They're like a people who are incredibly marginalized and have like all sorts of issues around like health and like education and stuff. And if you're American and you're like a stand-up comedian or something, or you're on like, was that like late night shows, or you can just shit all over them. And not a single person from that metropolitan fucking audience will say a goddamn thing. And so it's like, so I can see that there must be some appeal for like some like, especially like young white dudes in a place like the US, or maybe there's analogous things going on here in Australia, where like somebody comes along and says, hey, not so fucking bad. Actually, you know what? There's a lot of really cool, historically, a lot of really powerful white dudes or whatever. Like there's a lot of, and I can see why an audience who are being, especially, I don't know, maybe since the 90s, being really like culturally villainized. And yet in their own idiosyncratic experience of life, they might not have actually experienced any of these supposed advantages because they've grown up white and poor or whatever. And it's like being black and poor, being white and poor, it sucks being poor. Like it doesn't matter what color your skin is, right? So so I can understand the appeal, but the thing is like there's okay, so I can understand the appeal, and I can understand the criticisms, and I think they're really valid criticisms. Or like one of my other friends who's not white and poor, but white and middle class, feels like discriminated against when applying for jobs, right? For being a white male. And I was like, okay, like that's not good either. Like we don't want to live in that sort of society. Like shouldn't be arbitrarily discriminated against because you happen to be a white dude. Like all the social progress now is just like we just create new classes of people that we can discriminate against. That's not progress. So like, but the issue that I guess I have with BAP or Alamariu is that they're channeling that energy in like, to me it seems like into a net, at the very least, a waste of time, and in the worst case situation potentially like destructive. Like that's a good criticism. It's a really good point. There's those like society's made a mistake on this one, and we shouldn't do that, especially young people coming up. Like doesn't matter what color of skin they are, they like support young people trying to like get ahead in the world. All right, but now there's these people who are charismatic online, forming these like online communities, and they're coming up with like these are really like just how would I put it? I would put it as these ideas are not a real solution to your problem. If I was talking to like a young poor white dude who had these sorts of sentiments, like the solution to your fucking problem is like building yourself up and getting out of whatever situation that you're in, and not just like descending into what would you call like kind of resentment driven, like nihilistic, almost like apolitical, destructive attitude towards world like that. That's not going to help you out, man. What's going to help you out is like working hard, getting your shit together, and like getting above like all those things that are like you feel as though are pushing you down. At least that's what I would say to somebody. It's like try to like build them up. Don't these people? I think like Alamariu, he thinks he might be building them up, but I think he's like a, what would you call it? Like a Pied Piper.
Yeah, it is interesting that you bring up some of those things, because that is an interesting element of. I've heard them called, and some of them call themselves the New Right. There have been several iterations of the New Right, but the 2020s, 20-teens, 2020s version of the New Right is that they tend to be pretty openly anti-liberal, anti-democratic, which is a big difference, say, from conventional mainstream right-wing parties in the West, which are
still democratic.
They're conservative. What are they conserving? Well, the liberal tradition and the democratic tradition in which they arose. And so for someone like Costin Alamariu, it is really interesting you saying it's destructive, to which I expect he would say, like, it is to destroy the system. Like I'll give him this. He doesn't mince words or play word games when it comes to talking about his disdain for democracy and liberalism. Like, he is actually just very upfront about it. It's like, no, don't like mass democracy, don't like liberalism. So I guess it's fate praise, but at least he's being pretty upfront about it.
Yeah, I think aspect. I like
but
that.
It is a really interesting part of the youth right or the youth hard right, that it is actually quite consciously illiberal and anti-democratic.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess like the distinction between like, I don't kind of care what Dr. Alamariu would say to this. Like, wow, I was like me hypothetically speaking to one of his potential audience members, right? It's like, man, this guy's trash. Like, you can do way better than this guy. Like, go and listen to, like, go and read just go and read Plato for yourself. Like, don't listen, this guy's trash. And, like, yeah, I don't know. Like,
I guess the question is, to what how bad do you think it is? So
yeah. I think
let's just assume to make it easier. I'll, like, in saying this, just make a few assumptions. Like, okay, things are as bad for young white men as,
or there's a subsection.
Some like frog poster is going to say, or like as Bronze Age Pervert says it is. Like, let's just assume
some subsection. Yeah.
So the question is, what is best for you? Like, what is a future that is going to be best for you, and how do you reach it?
Yeah.
Do you try to do as well as you can within the current system, which is just out to get you as a young man? And this is one of my big problems with this part of the right, in that I feel it's really defeatist, in that a lot of them seem to be saying, like, you actually have no hope of getting to a place where you want to be by playing by the rules. In which case, if you do actually think that your future is so lost by playing by the rules, then what is most advantageous? Well, just rebellion. But the problem is there are a few things. One, like, rebellion's a big gamble. Maybe you get lucky and end up ushering in a society that you really want. Maybe it's the French Revolution and you get your fucking head chopped off by someone who's even more of a radical vitalist than you are once the terror begins. Or it turns out the rebellion is 10,000 people the world over on Twitter, and just like nothing fucking happens because you're completely disorganized. In which case, you've just been spinning your tires talking about rebellion, not trying to improve yourself within the conventional paradigm, because you say, well, there's no hope for me within that. So you're unskilled, part of a politically ineffective movement, in which case, yeah, you are fucked. Like, yeah, you're toast. You're not going anywhere. The conscious closing off of options or of plan Bs in favor of a LARP rebellion that I'm not convinced will happen, at least not in the way that they're saying it will, is, I think, pretty counterproductive. So in terms of like the right, it really wouldn't surprise me if, say, in Europe, the center of politics shifted quite a lot to the right. I think it is probably happening at the moment anyway. Is it going to be the right that Costin Alamariu says it will be, of Nietzschean vitalists? I doubt it. I think it's just going to get more nationalistic.
Yeah.
And more anti-globalist. In which case, like, again, trying to divine the practical advice given by new right people like Costin Alamariu still isn't going to do you any good. Because a more nationalistic right-wing Europe is still going to need engineers.
Yeah.
Becoming an engineer is still probably going to really help you in this society.
Yeah.
It just seems like the sort of thing that does young men a disservice.
I think so.
I guess that's probably where most of my irritation
It does do. So there's a couple of things to follow up on from that. Like, one of the other alternative options is that you win your rebellion and you don't get terror, you don't get your head lopped off, but you end up in a society like 1930s Germany or some shit, like where you do have a bunch of or like China during the where young people were running the show.
I get like the cultural revolution.
Like, there's been times where there have been youth revolutions, and look, like that's I don't know what to say.
Still don't talk about.
I don't know what to say. I don't know,
so
like
good.
the Hitler Youth Group, like the re-education like demonstrations in the Cultural Revolution. I mean, like, we've tried that shit before, man. Like, it doesn't work out well, like. But also the other thing is like, okay, so two more things. I think one is a little more waxing philosophical. So like, have some fucking perspective. Like this guy is very down on the world. I think he's a bit of like a just a doomy, gloomy, sort of mopey fucking grey cloud over his goddamn head, complains about everything. Meanwhile, the guy went to fucking Stanford and Yale and Columbia. It's like, how much, like, what an amazing educational experience to have. What an astonishing educational experience to have. Like, has probably received perhaps, like there's not many educational institutions in the world that would be more amazing to go to than those three. Like, you know, your Oxford, your Stanford, sort of like amazing educational institutions would have had the opportunity to meet amazing peers, travel around the world. Okay, he's from Romania, ends up in America, has all this opportunity, and he's communicating to tens of thousands of people around the world instantaneously, almost for free, using cutting edge internet technology, and the guy is still complaining. Give me a fucking break. Give me a break. This guy's a wimp. Like, put this guy in 1901 somewhere. He would have just been nothing. Like, nothing. Even with all this technological advantage and even with all the education thrown at him, he's still got the gall to complain. Like, give me a break. Dude, if you are like 20, 30, 40 something year old, like MIT educated, living in America, like you are one of like the most, like you've got the fact that you're in that position, you've got so much fucking opportunity and you still think the world is out against you, you're just a fucking loser. Like, I think this guy's just straight up just a fucking loser. Like, honestly, maybe not in terms of his accomplishments, but about in terms of like his mindset, his like attitude towards the world. He's a loser. And like, why would you want to follow and take the advice and adopt the mindset of a loser? Like, this guy is a fucking loser. Fuck him. And on a more practical note, any young dudes, like, I think most young dudes, essentially what they need is they need a little bit of direction. Somebody saying like, if you put your head down for 10 years, you can go and study something, become an engineer, become a carpenter or whatever. You can become really good at, and you can go out there and you can solve problems. Like, I think that's young people generally, but especially young men who don't receive, benefit from being told that if they work hard, pick something and stick to it, that they can become a causal agent in their own life and they can shape their life to be what they want it to be. They don't need fucking losers who waste their MIT education telling them about how grim the world is and that they should tear it down. This guy's a fucking loser. Fuck him.
Yeah. What really irritates me is that he's clearly not stupid. He's clearly smart. He's well educated. He's savvy in terms of advertising himself. He's created effectively an online business that is able to support him.
Peddling
He's
nihilism.
willing to have. He's willing to stand by ideas that are unpopular. Granted, most of his career so far, it's been behind a pseudonym, but you know, it's now increasingly tied to his name. And that stuff, like that's I admire a lot of that. The problem is, he puts it towards things that I think ultimately make young men more lost rather than fixing the problem.
Yeah. Not very helpful. Not actually very helpful. Yeah. I think it's interesting that somebody who clearly has the capacity to like, or could have the capacity to meaningfully solve like an interesting and practical problem instead puts it towards just like muddying the water. Like, but I can only assume that he just be like, you guys, one, you're liberal cucks, and two, like
He has a much bigger platform than us.
And also too, like, you guys are like, I am solving a problem. It's just not a problem that you guys think is a real problem or whatever. Like, so I guess also like the problem diagnosis is a big part of that as well. Yeah.
Yeah. And a problem diagnosis, if the problem he's diagnosing, not just in this book, but in general, including with the Bronze Age Pervert Twitter project of what do lost young men do, I think it's a real problem. Because, for example, if you just take this is a real problem. If it gets big enough, you have huge social instability, because young men are the social group who are most capable of affecting violence. They're the most prone to being violent as well. And so like, this is a group of people you need to work out what to do with. Like, a big group of angry young men without partners, sexual partners, is really dangerous. Like, this is actually something that, if you think it is a problem, it is worth addressing. It's just the way he's addressing it is almost, because he has a lot of antipathy towards our current political systems, is to try to encourage
destructive behavior,
young male violence.
Yeah. So I guess it's kind of like Andrew Tate or something, like just capturing a sentiment in the zeitgeist amongst young men in particular. And then, at least in, obviously, my evaluation, which isn't worth anything, it's worth as next as much as it is worth as much as the next random person on the internet. So, like, it doesn't really matter, does it? Like, I just think, like, to me, it's like, wow, such skill at building a platform, such skill, like, amazing, like, incredible talent. Andrew Tate, incredible talent in marketing and building brand and stuff. And Bronze Age Pervert, obviously not Tate level, but still, you know, as I said, like, bigger than our platform. And I just think, like, man, putting it towards such, like, if not wasteful, like, at the least wasteful, you know, at the worst, like, just negative for his own audience. Yeah, I think it's a shame. But that's me just, like, making my, like, arbitrary parochial judgments, like, can't get out of my own framework.
I don't know. I just feel like I would definitely be called by him, like, a liberal longhoused cuck for this. But, like, if you're a young dude and you're really worried about your place in the world, like, getting stable finances, starting a family is a really powerful way, especially with massively declining birth rates. Like, getting financially stable and having a bunch of kids, like, that's probably your best bet at really affecting the world.
And, like, having a meaningful life as well. You know, like, raising children well is hard, and it's also, you know, you're going to have a big impact on their lives and the lives of the people that they grow up to affect. So, like, you know, like, being a father, being a good dad, and, you know, not that I have kids yet, but I'm looking forward to it. Like, is super impactful, super meaningful thing to do, and you know, being good at your profession, having integrity, doing a good job to the best of your abilities. You know, like, you know, following through on your commitments and being reliable for the people that you work with. That's super important. Looking after your health, getting fit. You know, looking at yourself in the mirror each day, thinking, like, I'm better than I was better than I was yesterday, you know, like, I feel better, you know, all those things take a lot of work, a lot of energy, and are really good for you, and they're good for the people around you. And you can do all those things and also make some difference in society if you develop the capacity to then go and, you know, like, be a leader in your community or whatever. And you don't have to tear down. You don't have to tear everything down. Like, it's not helpful.
Well, it's also, you can affect change. You're not powerless. So this is, I will now be Jack as motivational youth leader. I'm speaking directly to the youth now. It's none of these things are easy.
They're not
but
easy.
As a young guy, as goals, if you orient yourself towards get good at something useful, get good at something that people pay you money, like, get good at fixing certain problems that people have and they'll give you money for it. Have a family. Like, orient yourself towards a meaningful relationship with someone, and having kids will ground you and make you a better person. And if you're worried about not making an impact on the world, if you create a bunch of kids and raise them well, you have a gigantic effect. And through history, that effect is going to reverberate. Like, that's how you don't die.
Yeah, potentially for
you keep
generations.
Living.
And, like, the market signal on, like, getting paid, like, other people, like, if there's a class of profession or a type of business that's profitable, or a profession that's getting paid a lot, it's because people value it. Like, if you go and acquire the skills to do that thing and get paid well, that's literally other people say, like, we value what you're doing. Here, take some fucking money. Like,
but it's like this advice.
It's
is
really
not,
bland advice, but
it doesn't have the philosophical rigor of selective breeding and the birth of philosophy. Broadly speaking, if you aim at get good at something useful and aim at start a family, you'll do pretty well.
And
those are good goals.
another thing on all this is like, as Jack said, it's not easy. But why would you want it to be easy? Like, where all the great adventurers and all the heroes in history and in fiction worth looking up to went out and they did hard things. Tell me an athlete that, or an actor, or a scientist, or an innovator who is worth remembering in your limited memory, who didn't go. The reason why you know who they are is because they did something amazing and they did something difficult. So, like, don't ask for easy things in life. Like, seek out challenges that will force you to evolve into a more capable person. And you might not be capable of causing things meaningful right now in your life if you're 19, and you might have to evolve into a better version of yourself in order to have children and to raise them well. And that will be a hard thing, but the person that you have to become to do those things well is a guiding light for your evolution as a person over the course of your life.
Yeah. And while I suppose Bapites would dismiss this advice as sort of milquetoast boomerisms, it's almost it's the same veneration of subversion for subversion's sake that you also see among
the transgression
campus leftists, where the transgression thing, it's like saying something that is at least superficially shocking has or infers some sort of truth value, and just reiterating basically the advice that your grandma would give you because it is said frequently is de facto wrong. You sometimes have to say, why have certain ideas persisted for a really long time? So, well, maybe there's something to them. Maybe there is something to what your grandma would have told you to do.
Yeah, and that kind of applies to like democracy as well. Like those institutions, there's institutions that we have in the Anglosphere in particular, like they didn't just come out of nowhere. Like there's been a lot of angry young men for generations in the past who have had their issues with those institutions, and they've like those institutions have evolved and like integrated all those complaints and responses. Like they're there for a reason. You might not always understand what they're doing exactly, but like they're not arbitrary. They didn't just come out of nowhere. They're like generations and generations old, and they've created the most prosperous, freest, most culturally generative societies in the history of human civilization, despite what Dr. Alamariu might suggest.
Yeah, and they can be fucking annoying. Really dumb decisions can be made. Really short-sighted decisions can be made. And it is possible for those sort of things, for those institutions to just kind of rabbit hole themselves into really, really weird directions. Like Congress in the USA at the moment, I'm not convinced is a meaningful decision-making organ. But it's kind of a reason why you should probably try to reform it rather than just say, okay, well, it's not working year zero, let's just start again.
Yeah. Popper made this point about like the issue that he had with communists or like socialists, because he was a socialist when he was younger, is that they prefer revolution over reformation or revolution over evolution. And it's like, yeah, like maybe the institution is broken, but that doesn't mean that you tear it down. That means you go and fix the fucking problem. Like,
yeah, well, there are so many things that the institution is doing that it'll be doing some things you don't like. The thing is, if you tear it down, you're going to have to consider all of the functions it was serving. And such is the limited nature of human knowledge, is you definitely are not seeing all of the things it's doing.
Yeah, for sure.
And you're now going to have to deal with
I'm going to rip down this complex sociological structure that has evolved over the last like 800 years and replace it with this newfangled thing that I just thought up with my friends on the internet. Good luck.
Maybe it's also a function of age, in that I've been wrong enough times in my life now where when something's really pissing me off, I have to think, you're probably getting something wrong here too. You're probably fucking something up, given that you've done it so many times in the past. Although, actually, no, Costin Alamariu is older than me, so he should have learned that too.
Yeah.
Spawned in 1980.
Oh, yeah. He's what? Wait, what? Oh, man, this guy's a lost cause.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure he was born. Let's have a look. If it's Costin, yeah, 21st May 1980, according to the font of all knowledge, Wikipedia.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't have much more to say about this book.
Yeah.
Would I recommend it? The introduction that he wrote for this edition, it's an interesting essay. It's like 45 pages or something. If you want to buy the book, like if you're willing to spend the money on the book to read that, yeah, it's not a bad thing to read. If you love that introduction, then you maybe read the rest of the book. But yeah, it's a kind of, I'd faintly recommend the introduction to this book, and probably not the rest.
Yeah. I really disliked it. I really dislike this guy. I really dislike apologists of like eugenics and racialism, and I'd like to have a break from it for a while on this show. So like no more race stuff, because yeah, I don't really have the patience for it at the moment. It might be a while. Yeah. Yeah, I guess if you're a young dude who happens to be listening to this, strongly consider our advice over the advice of Dr. Alamariu. Please.
This is just a deeply conservative position, but broadly speaking, just think about the advice that your grandma
would give you.
And she's probably right.
Remember, they saw some shit last century. They survived some stuff, you know, like talk to an old person who like lived through like the wars and like the Cold War and stuff.
Oh yeah, my wife's grandma, he lived in Prague. He was 15 when the Nazis left, and also lived through Bolshevism. He really saw some shit.
If somebody's listen to people who've come from like the Soviet bloc or whatever, like about what it's like to tear down old systems, create new systems and stuff. Like it's like yeah. And which is like ironic given that this guy's Romanian, right? Like he should know better. But like unless I'm mistaken about Romania. No. Romania had the fucking dictator with the
Ceausescu. It wasn't.
No.
Right.
No. Alamariu should know better. Geez, that's a severe lack of historical.
That is. I guess that's my parting words on this book.
Listen to your grandma.
Don't read it. Give your grandma a call and tell her that you love her. That's all from me.
My parting words are no more racialism books for a while. 2 thumbs down from me. It was a boring version of Bronze Age mindset. Just go and read that instead.
All right. Thanks for listening. Gee, almost 4 hours.